Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we're going to be covering some of the most overrated aspects of the college admissions process. So, number one, passion projects and nonprofits. So, some of our listeners who've tuned into past episodes will know that I hate the term passion project. It can be a giveaway to an admissions officer that something is artificial or a gimmick in a student's resume. It's a term that primarily originates from private admissions counselors. And so it's a term that we don't want to assign to any activity or undertaking in a resume. For students who are about to apply in the upcoming application cycle, please do not use this term passion project in any of your essays, in your activities list, or anywhere throughout your application. What is fundamentally wrong with the term, besides the fact that it can be a giveaway that the student had help with the process or their parent is engineering some project of some sort, the problem with the term is it's almost a contradiction in terms. What these colleges are really looking for is students who have these passions that really represent an infinite game or an infinite interest, right? These are things that ideally, in the way that you want to present them, they are passions that the student has pursued, hopefully over a long duration of time, and that they will continue to pursue for a long duration of time, into the future, encompassing both the student's time at the college, how they'll contribute in the classroom, outside the classroom, the extracurriculars, the clubs, how they'll be involved in the college, and then how they will contribute to the world beyond, right? Now, of course, this isn't a hard and rigid requirement, and I think this is where a lot of people go wrong. They're trying to identify this hook or this focus for their applications and their resume building that we've discussed at length on this podcast, and they're making it too overwhelming because they are treating it as though it's something forever. It doesn't have to be forever in reality, but it does need to you don't need to say this in the application. You don't need to really even 100% go into, that I want to go into this career, and I think it's actually strategically better to leave that out. In a lot of cases, it might be disingenuous, right? A student might have pursued something for a few years, and that's sort of the angle that we're taking for admissions because we have to apply at a given point in time, right? And we're sort of trying to make the most out of what we currently have and our current strengths and our current passions that we have evidence for. And I don't think that you even necessarily want to project super far in the future because it might be disingenuous. You might not actually want to pursue this field or this thing that you've built. You might not want to pursue it, as a career forever. And so, there might be a bit of that dissonance of it is extremely, inauthentic and disingenuous to say that in your application. But at least in principle, what these admissions officers are trying to do is they're trying to identify, really, if we're being honest, and a lot of people might not like this term, prodigies, right? They're trying to identify students who have a certain amount of precociousness in certain fields because they just represent better horses to make, significant contributions in those fields and make a significant impact, on the world if they had a much earlier head start, if they're really in love with that field, and they pursued it for a good amount of time before they're actually applying to college. So the notion of a passion is something that really is something that you love. It's hard to even separate yourself from it. Think about things that you're passionate about. You have some hobby. You like eating dessert or ice cream or something. It's like that's not something where you're trying to limit it. But the notion of project, once we put this term project and append it to the end, a project is something that usually has a finite scope, right? And so we're sort of trying to combine two things. Like a passion is something that if you really love it, it's, I don't have to necessarily, pay you to do it. Like you just want to do it. There's an intrinsic reward there, intrinsic value. You naturally gravitate to it. You're pulled towards it. You don't have to be pushed towards it, right? It's something that, is really, boundless. You're not trying to limit something that is a very significant passion. A lot of people would want to do it as much as they possibly, can. On the other hand, a project is something that's very finite and limited, in terms of scope. And so there just is some contradiction here. And again, what admissions is really about is it's trying to identify students who are, willing to play these sort of infinite games, or at least can present that sort of image, right? It's that you love something, you're so passionate about it that, you get soaked up in it and it just pulls you so much, right? And that passion is really ideally what you want to jump off the page to an admissions officer that they can just see, like, you can just tell, that somebody, like, they really just love something, right? I'm not saying that that has to, again, be the reality 100% on the back end, but that is just what is most effective. Because honestly, it's just most effective in life, right? I mean, if you're at a social gathering, you just tell somebody is like obsessed over something and they just can't stop talking about it. Right? It's just, you might not like what they're interested in, or you might not be interested in it, but it's hard to deny if you were sort of placing bets and sort of saying, is this person going to be successful at this thing? Or, you would just tend to bet on that person, right? It's all they talk about. They're consumed by it. They're obsessive. And so admissions in a lot of ways, it's a gamble. It's placing bets on, the students and what they're going to bring to the college and to the world beyond so that they reflect well on the college. So I don't like this term passion project. I think it's really a contradiction between something that should be sort of infinite and boundless, at least, in the way that it seems, and then a project which is sort of quite finite, something that you're trying to limit in terms of its time or its duration. It's just a very poor term to use. And again, it's used a lot by admissions professionals. And it's just not something that you definitely don't want to label anything a passion project in your application. Even more than that, you do really want to, again, going back to a lot of the earlier episodes in this podcast, you do want to be auditing. There are definitely strategic parts of this process, and we talk a lot about strategy, but particularly for students who need to think about something they're going to be pursuing for multiple years and aren't just about to apply to college right now, it's very hard to pursue something that you're not really interested in. It is, just even in terms of your own way of thinking about this process as a student or, as a parent for a student, you don't want to take up endeavors, particularly over a long time course, that are going to feel absolutely grueling and that you want to limit them to just projects, right? It's just such a huge competitive advantage. And honestly, it's one of the very unfair advantages of this entire process that there are just students who the thing that is the most strategic is just the thing that they're the most passionate about, and they just got very lucky. Warren Buffett could have been extremely passionate about sewing, right? And then nobody would have ever heard of him. So it's just, there are certain, vehicles that are very strategic or high leverage that, people just happen to be extremely passionate about them and they happen to be lucky and things happen to sort of align. But you do want to really say, if I'm always trying to limit this thing and it always feels like a chore and a burden and a sacrifice, you do want to think very carefully about that. There's definitely a large part of this process that does entail sacrifice, difficulty, stress, anxiety, all these things that so many people are telling kids nowadays are bad and terrible. But that is definitely a part of the process. We are talking about highly selective colleges that are extremely competitive. And so it should be hard. I don't know where people get this notion that this shouldn't be extremely difficult, extremely competitive, extremely stress-inducing, extremely anxiety. I don't know why we would think that that wouldn't be the case if we have these extremely high goals. That being said, to the extent that you can pursue fields or areas that you just are naturally pulled towards, because you will still have to do very hard stuff and still make sacrifices on top of that, right? You might run a business and love a company and love what you do, but you still have to eat your vegetables, right? You still have to do your taxes, and there's compliance and there's regulation and there's HR and all this stuff, right? That are still not necessarily fun. As much as you possibly can, you do want to really say to yourself, well, if I'm always trying to limit this thing or push to the margins or limit my amount of time doing this or turn it into a project, something that's very, finite in scope and limited in scope, you need to really be honest with yourself of, is this what you should be tackling or pursuing? The other term that that increasingly just hate is just nonprofits, labeling an organization nonprofit. It's just not necessary in almost the vast majority of cases to turn something into a nonprofit. The fact that there are some technicalities involved and some legal aspects involved can signal again that the student's parents were involved or somebody else was involved, which you never really want to tip in admissions. It's just not necessary, right? Unless there's some reason why, you need to take donations and the person who's donating needs to get a tax write-off, or who knows what it would be, why you would need to make it a nonprofit. But the vast majority of students, they can have something that is substantively the same without the nonprofit label, right? And it also just removes some extra work and some extra headache with getting a nonprofit set up. Can you do it pretty quickly and do legal Zoom? I'm sure you can. It's just increasingly using a term and a label that has become oversaturated in college admissions. And again, it hits certain nerves among missions officers in this process of just something being fake, it being artificial, it coming from a parent, it coming from, somebody else that's not the student. There are going to be other students that are labeling the organizations nonprofits. It's even like a running joke, it's like, to get into top school, you have to cure cancer and start a nonprofit, right? Again, you just don't want to hit certain nerves here. So I would suggest avoiding, at the very least, the labeling of something as a nonprofit. Number two, leadership and service. So these are major cliches in the process. One of the biggest issues in college admissions, but honestly, just in all consulting and I would say just advice giving, I think people are horrifically bad at giving advice. And I was just on a call earlier today and we were discussing this is that in admissions and advising, a lot of people have these questions. And they'll ask these questions. Should I take AB physics or should I take AP chemistry? Should I do this summer program or should I not do this summer program? And the problem with that is there's no context. I just don't have any context, right? It's like, what are you optimizing for, right? What's your current resume? What's your hook? And the problem is, and this is frustrating to a lot of people, and I understand being a consummately impatient person, I understand that people don't want to, you know, I had a roommate in college and they used to ask me, every single time every single time I ask you a question, why do you ask me another question? And I was like, because I'm a philosophy major, I don't know what to tell you. But it's the same thing in advising and admissions, right? It's if somebody is just you're asking them a question and they're just giving you a quick answer and they're not asking you a whole bunch of other questions unless they already have a whole bunch of context, they're likely not giving you the correct answer, right? Because the answer has to be calibrated based on what you're optimizing for, what your past history is, what time point are you at in the admissions process. There's just, all of the nuances of your school, if it's course selection, what are the reputations of the teachers, are there any grade deflating courses? Like, there's a million nuances and contextual variables. And one of the biggest reasons why I think people give terrible advice in life is because there's a misalignment between what's being optimized for between the two parties that are, exchanging the advice. There's so many just cliches and, answers that are lacking in context. And I think this is really why this process is very confusing to people because something might be correct. You might have heard something on somebody else's podcast. And a lot of people do this way. I read this on a Reddit forum. I heard this in somebody else's podcast, but then you say that, and then I heard this other thing. And sometimes, honestly, the answer is that all the parties are right, but in different contexts. There's all sorts of moderator variables and mediator variables and all sorts of other contextual, nuances, right? So, there's just a lot of very generic terms, generic cliche, and they're just not very specific or calibrated. And I think among these terms are leadership and service. So this sort of exhortation to have leadership and to do service. I don't like these terms and I don't like these maxims because they're too generic and they're too cliche, right? If your leadership is, you're the captain of the football team, but you're not going to play football at the college that you want to go to, it's basically a moot point. I know this is a tough, thing for a lot of people to hear, though probably not for a lot of people who've listened to this podcast for long enough because you understand that this process at the elite colleges for students who are not going to be recruited athletes. Sports are basically, I always say there's two categories of sports, recruited and irrelevant. You're either a recruited athlete or it's not relevant to your admissions hook because it's not your admissions hook. If you're an athlete and you're being recruited to be an athlete, well, then that is essentially your admissions hook. You have to have strong academics, you have to have strong testing, strong metrics. In a lot of cases, obviously, that there's some extra variables there. But generally, for a lot of the top schools, you do need to have a very strong academic maybe not to play basketball at Duke, but
Usually, you need to have pretty strong metrics, but your resume in a lot of cases is going to be your athletics, right? That is your hook. When you're a student and you're applying for an academic position at the school, as most people are because they're not student athletes, you're trying to be recruited for your academics. So, if you're a captain of the football team and you're applying to be a business major, that leadership doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, right? And you're like, but I don't know, somebody said this, and like, oh, it's still leadership. It doesn't matter. It's not relevant leadership. So we have to really think very specifically when it comes to leadership and service. Is this relevant or calibrated to my hook? Right? That is the critical part. It needs to be relevant leadership or relevant service or calibrated service. And I've talked a lot about generic service, just being a kid who just, does midnight runs or a soup kitchen. I think it's just much better. I'm not taking issue with being a good human being by any stretch of the imagination. But I actually think it's much higher leverage and a very good learning lesson for a teenager to understand that a lot of your highest leverage in life for giving back is through what you're the best at. If you're an extremely talented lawyer, you have much more leverage because you have a gift or a talent for giving back through that vehicle than you probably have going to a soup kitchen where honestly it's very easy to replace you. Like it's just not very specialized, that contribution, right? So I think it's much better even just in terms of life for a lot of students to think that your highest leverage point of giving back is going to be through what are, sort of your unique passions, interests, talents. Those are a lot of your highest levers in terms of, contributing to the world or other human beings. So I think it's not just strategically that it is a cliche, the soup kitchen. It's going to blend in with all the other applicants, but I think there's a more important, broader lesson there as well. Number three, Naviance Score, My Learning, all these different high school application systems where you can see, the scattergrams. So a lot of people are very, very familiar with this. They might be looking at these actively, have been throughout the spring, the summer, for students who are about to apply to college. It depends on the high school. Some high schools will give you access to these systems and the scattergrams earlier in high school. But for a lot of people, they start looking at these scattergrams. And so these are basically just scattergrams of past students from your high school who've applied to given colleges, and you could generally you're going to see two primary data points. You're going to see GPA, and then you're going to see test scores, right? And that's variable nowadays because obviously there's test optional, and so you're not always going to see a test score. It might say the student one test optional, etc. The problem with these graphs, for anybody who wants a deeper dive, this was an earlier episode that I did with just going through all of the problems with these systems. The episode was how to actually interpret acceptance data. It's just there's so much nuance that's missing from these systems. It's imperfect. The entry is imperfect. People don't put in the correct data or they don't put in any data. You don't always know what the time range is for the data or how expired it is. There's major inflection points in admissions. There's a big inflection point, post test optional and COVID. If you're looking at data, the years matter a lot. During COVID, you had a lot of students getting in off of wait lists. The following year, you had a lot of students who had deferred their admission. And, that 2020, 2021 application cycle is still probably the most, among the most competitive, if not the most competitive in admissions history, because there were a lot of students who took up spaces because they had deferred their acceptances due to COVID. So there's a lot of nuances. You don't know what the time range is. But even if you have GPAs and you have years and you have the test scores, there's 900 variables that go into a student's case. Some cases you might score does in some cases put what the major is, but even that is like a pre-configured list. It doesn't always map to the actual majors at the colleges. That's even messy. A student might click the wrong thing or put the wrong thing. It's not good data. And I discussed this in that episode that I mentioned, how to actually interpret acceptance data. But the way to really use these systems properly is just to know whether at a fundamental level you're in range. Just the foundation of your application, right? The necessary component, the metrics, right? And so the only thing you can really use this data for is to eliminate a student's candidacy from saying it's in contention in a college, but you can't use it to prove that a student is going to gain admission to the college. And the reason for that is just a fundamental asymmetry between the negative factors and the positive factors, right? So the negative factors that could keep out a student from a highly selective college versus the positive factors that could get a student in. And the problem is there's just a huge asymmetry there, right? So I discuss this a lot, but 1B or 2Bs can get you eliminated from the top 20 colleges in the United States, right? And so it's just one or two mistakes can eliminate you. But the number of things that would get you into those top 20 colleges, well, let's think about them, right? It's like, okay, well, you need to have amazing grades. You have taken extremely rigorous courses. You need to have excellent teacher recommendations. You need to write great essays. You need to have a hook. You need to have a strong resume that builds your hook. And then you just go on and 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 have a great interview. You need to get great, first marking period grades in senior year, right? So it's just like the list is extremely long for all the things you need to do to get into one of those colleges, but the number of things that would take you out of contention for one of those colleges, it could just be one thing that just eliminated you from contention altogether. Because again, we have the law of large numbers. We have tons of students applying across the country, and it's just a numbers game. There are just a ton of students who are extremely competitive for these colleges. And so, any blemishes get amplified in that context. So the only thing you can really use these systems for is to show that a student's not competitive for a college, but you can't use it to show that a student's going to get into a college, and you don't have a lot of requisite context. There's outliers. If you're looking at an average GPA, the average is skewed by outliers on the graph. You don't have context like, did the student have any, extra non-academic hooks like legacy, athlete? Everybody likes to say, oh, there was somebody with a 3.4 who got into, Yale or something, right? And it's just like, you don't make arguments from anomalies and exceptions, as much as people like to, right? So you really have to tread carefully with these systems, and again, they should really only be used as a very small data point if you're going to use them at all in terms of assessing, I would say, minimum viable candidacy for a school. It cannot, if you're looking at a graph for Princeton and you think that because your GPA and test scores are the same as three other students who've gone to Princeton from your high school, and you think that that means you're going to get into Princeton, you're out of your mind. Out of your mind, right? There's 900 other variables that drive the student getting into Princeton. That is necessary, but is not sufficient for admission to a school such as that. Number 4, summer programs. So again, we have another episode on this, so I'll try not to belabor the point a little bit, or try to belabor it too much. Most people who've listened to prior episodes know that, there are certain things that I hate in terms of students, candidacy building. There are certain things that I love, such as early decision. So I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse here too much. But for those who are a little bit newer to the podcast, we do have an episode that was called The Truth About Summer Programs. And just because these are extremely popular among many students and many families, that episode went into a lot of depth onto why a lot of summer programs are extremely problematic. But summer programs, at a fundamental level, I'll just kind of recap some of the issues with them because this falls right into this episode's theme, which is just highly overrated. Issue number 1 is way too many students do them. And so a lot of this process is, you'll hear me talk a ton about scarcity, uniqueness, nicheness. It's a competition. You're trying to stand out, right? You're trying to be different from other people. One of the big issues with summer programs is just in psychology, there's psychological bias called availability bias, right? And it's just sort of what's in front of everybody's eyes. And, the summer programs, they do a ton of marketing because they're third-party vendors and businesses that license out the college's names. And so they do a ton of marketing. They're run like businesses. So they'll send mailers, they'll send emails. Other students do them. There's a lot of allure because they're structured programs. A lot of people have an aversion to non-structured opportunities because they view them as having higher risk. They have higher upside in a lot of cases, but a lot of people just like things that are very structured. Also, one thing that I'm increasingly just realizing over time is I think a lot of people like to have the feeling of like a very structured summer and the students, here for 3 weeks and then we have our vacation for 3 weeks versus what really needs to actually happen for a lot of what students do over the summer that's higher value, which is you need to be sending reach outs and getting internships or getting research opportunities or, launching an initiative in your town. And these are much more asynchronous, they're flexible. You should be very open to this, where you may get something and it may happen in May. I was just talking, on a call about this, and it's, if you plan out your summer by February, and then the kid all of a sudden, has an opportunity to research in a niche area with a Stanford professor, but they get that in June, right? Or they get it in May, you've now blocked out your summer and, the student might not be able to partake of that, very high value, extracurricular. So I think there's just a lot of, people view a lot of upside to sort of the structure or the program. I think honestly, a lot of parents are just always thinking about very easy vehicles, to get the job done, which is why I think that's a large part of the allure of a lot of private high schools, a lot of feeder schools. It's like sort of you think it's like a set it and forget it, right? It's like, oh, if my kid goes to Hotchkiss or they go to, Exeter, they go to whatever, Horace Mann, or they go to Choate, right? It's like, I can look at the matriculations, and we've talked about this in prior episodes, and this is going to give them a much higher chance of getting into a college, or I don't have to worry because and it's a bunch of nonsense. But a lot of people are looking for that, right? They're looking for easy boats to get in where they just put the kid in the boat and, that provides some huge multiple in their odds of getting into a selective college. And unfortunately, it's not that easy. So, the summer programs, they're just too common. Too many students have them in their resume. They're too available. They're too in front of everybody's eyes, which it just negates the uniqueness of it as an extracurricular. Um, they are just not fundamentally changing a lot of what a student does during the normal course of the school year in a lot of cases. Because what a lot of these colleges are looking for, and I mentioned this in the last episode about sort of low agency, high agency, but a lot of these colleges are looking for high agency students, right? Students who can exist outside of structure. And a lot of school is just structure. Like it's just, and I'm not saying this is, there's obviously a ton of pros to, structure. And I mean, we have a extremely structured, program with to-do lists and everything needs to be done by this and a deadline. And, you need that accountability to make, a lot of progress. You have a lot of discipline. But a lot of ways admissions officers are looking for a student who can impose that structure or that discipline themselves, right? They don't need a teacher sort of hovering over them. They don't need to walk into, a classroom in a school and to be told and graded and, to know that it counts for something, right? Because they're trying to suss out real passion. And passion, true passion, in a lot of cases exists in the shadows. It doesn't exist when somebody's hovering over you, giving you a grade. It's like you almost have no choice, right? It's like there's built-in shame, there's built-in punishment and reward mechanisms in school. You get report cards, your teachers know. It's not like you can skip school and not get in trouble. And so in a lot of ways, what students do outside of the classroom and in an absence of structure is a lot more of an honest signal of what they're actually passionate about. And so there is this sort of weird sort of agency structure paradox here, or sort of passion structure paradox, where they're a little bit at odds with each other, right? And I talked about this a couple of episodes ago when I was answering some questions, and the listener had asked about like college courses, right? And I said, you don't want to really think about college courses in terms of resume building because the resume is more for the passion or the hook. College courses are more in the metrics column, right? They're a little bit more transactional, they're numbers, it's kind of beefing up your course rigor. But you don't really want to use college courses as much. It's not that they don't signal passion at all. Of course, if you're passionate about evolutionary prology and you go and take a course in it, that's not afforded to you by your high school context, that certainly does signal it does signal passion, but it's not a huge mix up from what you're normally doing, on your day-to-day grind in high school throughout, the vast majority of the year anyway, right? And so to sort of get a bit more of an inflection point in terms of a different type of something different that you're doing, you don't want to just go and over the summer, it's like, oh, here's another thing where the kid's sitting in a classroom and there's somebody who runs it and there's structure and there's a group of 30 kids, right? And so there's that issue. I don't think that they lend as well a lot of summer programs to high agency, very high initiative. It's not a student who's sort of, doing research and they sort of have a lot of initiative in the research and they pick the very specific field and the very specific niche, because they reached out and there's thousands of professors or people, tens of thousands all over the world doing research, right? There's not that many summer programs, and they can't all be they can't be as niche as research can be, right? In research, you can get just laser precision into a niche or a very specific question, right? You can't do that with a summer program. So there's that issue. So you have availability bias. Too many students have them. They're non-differentiating. There's a bit of a issue with just the structured program. There's logistics issues. If you're going to do an in-person summer program, now there's an opportunity cost there if you can't be somewhere else, which I'll get to and discuss a little bit more one of the future points. It could take up time. You might have limited access to other opportunities during that. If the program's expensive, it can signal privilege. It can signal, I've talked about this again at length in the Truth About Summer Programs episode. If you sign up for a program at a specific college that has a certain name, then, that could potentially signal your interest in that college, and then you try to go put it in your activities list or your resume and your application, and then, you're applying to Brown, and Brown sees that you did the Georgetown program, and that can also present a little bit of an issue because colleges are also, as I mentioned on this podcast, concerned about their yield and where you can end up enrolling, right? A lot of people just don't sufficiently account for that part of the equation because they just think that this process is all about just merit. What's my score out of 10 as an applicant, right? And the way that I tried to reframe that is it's much more similar to an expected value assessment, where you need to not only assess what the student's value is as a candidate to the institution in an absolute sense, but then you also must account for the risk of the student doesn't actually enroll at the institution. And so this is what this would be expected value or what I might deem realizable value, right? You might be an 8 out of 10 applicant, but if you have a 50% chance of enrolling at the college, the realizable value is only a 4 out of 10, right? 50% out of 8, right? And so a lot of people just don't take that into account, right? That yield factor in the admissions process. Increasingly more people do as it's sort of gotten out that there are students who get rejected that are highly qualified for certain colleges or maybe even quote unquote overqualified, but the colleges think that they're going to enroll. It's entered the collective consciousness more over time, but I still don't think is accounted for enough by many students and families. So there's that issue. You can tip your possible preference for one college. Of course, all of that could be obviated by doing early decision, right? If you're doing early decision to Brown and they see that you did a Georgetown summer program, who cares? It's like, if I take you, you have to come. And that again is one of the big benefits of early decision. You don't do early decision and these colleges track how many times you click their emails, how long you watch the videos. Like and with AI, it's going to get even crazier how well colleges can predict or the models that they can build to predict enrollment. One of your only antidotes to that, because it should scare people that the colleges is just all big data now. Just think about all of the data you can aggregate. You can look at a high school and you can look at 30 years of yield data from that high school to see how often kids from that particular high school yield at your college, right? You can do it by GPA ranges. The amount of data that you can pull from an application in a student's context. You could say students who have this background or students from Georgia, what's their yield rate? Students from this specific city, it's not that hard if you have sufficient technology to build pretty good models that can forecast. Your only antidote to that or your only defense against that is doing something like early decision. Otherwise, the colleges will just keep getting better and better and better. And you think that you think that you're tricking the colleges because you're like, "Oh, I'm applying to 18 colleges," right? They don't know whether I'm coming. It's like, don't be so sure of that, and increasingly over time, don't be so sure. Don't be so sure of that. So, that is another sort of nuanced problem with a lot of the summer programs. It's not the end of the world. There are more fundamental issues, such as they're just not rare or unique or differentiating in the vast majority of cases. There's not as high agency as alternatives, and some of those are the more fundamental, heavier hitting issues, but there are more nuanced issues, like I said, tipping privilege, tipping school preferences. Next one, supplementary or additional recommendations. So a lot of students, and I think again, I sort of call this a failure of imagination or a failure of perspective taking. A lot of people just don't put themselves in the shoes of somebody who's reading all these applications, right? And they sort of lack that fundamental empathy. A lot of people might be like, empathy, schmempathy, like these admissions officers are terrible people. They reject 97% of the applicants at Stanford. I hate these people. They're nitpickers, they're professional, critics. Yeah, they are, and all that being said, it's still to your benefit to still see the world through their eyes, right? And to try to put yourself in their shoes as much as you possibly can, right? So you can sort of poo-poo it and say these are bad people and they reject all these students or whatever. It's their job. It's like, what do you want me to tell you? It's their job, right? It's like if you're a recruiter for a company, it's not your job to take worse applicants over better ones, and if there are a whole bunch of pretty much perfect applicants, but there's one person who's got one slight thing a little bit better, it's like, and I have one spot, it's my job to take that person, right? And then, oh, applicant 2 and applicant 3 and applicant 4 are gonna say, "Oh, this is ridiculous, like, this is nitpicky," or whatever. It doesn't matter, it's my job to take the best applicant. So, and obviously that's couched a little bit to some extent in the best applicant who also has a certain probability of enrollment, as I just discussed. But all that aside, you do want to try to take an admissions officer's perspective. And I think that a lot of people just that they lack this perspective taking ability in two fundamental aspects. One is they just put too much information and they dilute their application a lot because they get this, what I refer to as kitchen sink syndrome, throwing the kitchen sink at it. And so it's just like, let me load up. I have 4 people who could write me an amazing letter of recommendation, 4 teachers, or I have 2 people who know me from this, organization or whatever. They have a limited amount of time. A lot of schools will not review supplementary recommendations. They don't require the admissions committees to review them, or they just won't review them at all. And so 2 teacher recommendations are what you want to have, particularly for the top and highly selective colleges that we focus on this podcast. There are certain schools where, for instance, Penn, it's a little bit more flexible. You could do 2 teacher recommendations. You could do 1 teacher, and then you could do 1, sort of extracurricular or club supervisor or supplementary recommendation. But for a lot of the top colleges, you need to plan on having 2 teacher recommendations, and that's generally, going to be advantageous. There are exceptions. For the UCs, there's no recommendations usually required at all. There are some outliers, but to sort of be sufficiently prepared, you generally want to have 2 teacher recommendations. Anything past 2 teacher recommendations is generally overkill, and you need to be thinking to yourself every single time you add information to your application, it needs to be either it needs to improve your application, right? And there's a big burden of proof or a big onus on you that anytime you are unnecessarily extending your application file, and by unnecessarily extending, I mean that you are partaking in some elective, you know, optional action, something that's not required, right? So supplementary recommendation is not required. A third teacher recommendation is not required by any college, right? So anytime you're going of your own accord here, and you're adding to a file where that's not required by the college as part of the application, you do bear the burden of proof to really make sure that adds a lot of marginal value or adds new information that's not just going to be redundant, right? And so it can't just be it's not doesn't work this way where it's, if I have 2 really good teacher recommendations and they have a third, I sort of improved it now it's sort of 3x instead of 2x, right? This is not the way that it works, right? It's they have 2 people who've already said great things about you, and I don't need a third person to then say it's like, otherwise we would just be submitting 18, right? And then the person who has 18 would win over the person who has 6. Like, that's just not how it works. Is there, something that this person's gonna say that really just is over the top in terms of adding value to my application, or adds really new information. And if it's teachers, well, then you just make that teacher in the first place one out of the two teacher recommendations, right? So there's just no real reason to do three teachers. It's just so unlikely that you have three teachers who think the absolute world of you. You can give them a brag sheet with 20 amazing anecdotes from classroom, talking to them outside conversations. You did this extra project and talking about it in the office. It's just, I can't think of any students who have three absolutely exceptional and exceptional for the top colleges. All of these kids are smart. They all have great grades. They're all intellectual. It's just like the standard for exceptional for the top colleges is just really, really high, right? So it's just very unlikely that you're going to have three where it's just there's absolutely exceptional standout. They think the world of me and they all contribute, sort of unique value that doesn't overlap or, content. Be very careful in terms of adding additional recommendations. Past two is just like, there's basically no use case for it in terms of teacher recommendations. A counselor recommendation is required by a lot of the top colleges. Some of the lower ranked schools or even some of the higher ranked schools that are bigger schools may not require a counselor recommendation. A lot of them do. So again, you have to generally be armed with, for the top colleges and just to be safe in general, applying to college, you generally need to be armed with two teacher recommendations and a counselor recommendation. Now, past that, in terms of supplementary recommenders, so a club advisor, your debate coach, somebody from your community, a research mentor, somebody who supervised you in an internship of some sort, generally, unless it's going to be absolutely exceptional, unless it's relevant to your hook, it's just you're lengthening the application. There's a famous saying in admissions, the thicker the file, the thicker the applicants. You have a very big burden of proof anytime that you're adding pages to your application or adding more content than the college wants. And we've seen colleges, they don't like some of this, right? They just shortened for this upcoming year, they just shortened the additional information section because a lot of students are putting too much in it. They're putting fluff in it. They're just putting nonsense in the additional information section. It's not adding any marginal value. It's just driving admissions officers crazy. If you're going to do a supplementary recommendation, it better be amazing. It better be extremely specific, and you can provide all those anecdotes to the person, have a conversation with them. Just don't leave anything to chance. Don't leave it to their memory, but it better be exceptional. And if it's a supplementary recommendation, it better be related to your hook in almost the vast majority of cases, unless they're just somebody who's going to say that, I think this person is the best person in the world for a million reasons. But I mean, you almost always want it to be related to your hook and to be extremely high value if you're going to add a supplementary recommendation to your file. Do not piss off admissions officers. You do not want these people to be very cranky or annoyed while reading your application. The next overrated aspect, very similar, recommendations from people that you think are quote unquote connections to the college. So I can't even tell you how many people over the years, parents reach out and they say, "Oh, I know Bob Logan, from the law firm, and he is on this board at Duke, and we're in the Hamptons, and I just spoke to, you know, Johnny Epstein. He said he would write Susie a great letter." It's a bunch of nonsense 99% of the time, and it's going to hurt your application. One of the reasons why this happens is a lot of people like to status signal. They like to feel like they're important or, they have pull at the college. In the vast majority of instances, they don't. There are very few people who are highly influential who can change an admissions decision. The likelihood that the person that you're talking to or the family friend has any significant pull over the admissions process is just extremely low. That's number one. Number two, even if they did, or even if you're going to get a letter from, a famous person or somebody, a politician, the problem with it again is an expected value assessment here, right? You're trying to take and this is the cognitive balance phenomenon. Right? So cognitive balance is not only do we measure the content of what somebody says, but we also take into account the person who's providing the information, right? And so, what a lot of students and parents are thinking is if this person has this given title or, is a popular person, or they're a famous politician or celebrity, or they're connected to the school, or they're a big figure. That will sort of fill in a lot of the equation here, but they don't account for the other variable, which is the content of the letter itself, right? And the problem is, even if a family member does know somebody, or is connected to, some, important figure or some important figure at the school, it's very rare that that person knows the student extremely well and can write an extremely compelling letter of recommendation. A lot of higher ups, trustees will even write letters that sort of have code in them that sort of signals to an admissions officer, like, I'm just kind of doing this as a favor to the family, but don't take this too seriously. And it's just like a gesture. This can also hurt your admissions odds. And so it's very precarious. I talk a lot about, I refer to it as baseline versus plot line. Baseline is just the information. It's just what's on the paper, and plotline is the sort of the peripheral, the surrounding narrative of what's actually going on, right? Sort of, it's a human being reading into the attentions of the information that's been provided. And the plot line is very problematic when you have somebody who's connected to the school writing a letter of recommendation, or a celebrity figure, or somebody who's suspiciously close to the dad's field and their occupation. They can tell what's going on. They can tell that there's potential manipulation going on here. And the last thing in the world that is going to paint a favorable view of a student's application is manipulation, or connections that are coming from privilege, or the parent's network. It's not a good look, and it can backfire and actually end up hurting the student's application. Tread very carefully. The only exceptions, and again, you're adding non-necessary materials to the application. The only exceptions would be, first of all, if it's a trustee or it's somebody major, these people aren't going to throw around their power and their influence, and really back and write the type of letter that can move the needle in terms of admission decision. They're going to just throw that around for anybody, because if they just threw it around for anybody, it would eventually over time just become meaningless, right? Their power. So, and it wouldn't be taken seriously. It's just very unlikely that a lot of those people are going to actually, if they have that type of power, that they're going to use it, because you're some loose family friend or acquaintance, or you summer together in the Hamptons. Like, it's just not the case. But the main exceptions would be the person really knows the student extremely well. They can write stuff that's extremely detailed, and you can't just provide made up anecdotes to this person. So it does need to be genuine to a large extent. So if you have a long running significant relationship with a student, and would have a lot of great content for the letter besides just what the letterhead is in their name, then that would push it towards possibly considering it. But even on top of that, ideally, you would also, again, want them to have some relevant expertise or perspective in the student's field. Those are generally going to be the two variables that are going to determine, honestly, just a lot of the way that you think about the application process, but certainly in terms of adding additional materials is, that, can they speak in a very promising way about the student, and can they speak specifically to the student's promise in this field that's related to their application theme and their hook? Next up, in terms of overrated, the common application. So how on earth is the common application overrated, Sam? So there's the common application itself, and then there's, I think, strategically what the common application represents in terms of a bit of broader strategic concepts. So the common application, I think, has a lot of liabilities just in terms of the way that students think about the process. First of all, the word common, I couldn't think of a worse possible word to associate with the admissions process. Everything you are trying to do in admissions is to be different, to stand out, to be unique, to approximate as much and as close to a 1 out of 1 as you possibly can. There could be no worse word for admissions than common, right? Obviously, the word makes sense because it's the common application. It's an application that all these different colleges have in common, but it already starts to fundamentally just contradict a lot of what admissions is. And there's just a lot of issues in terms of the common application. For one, a lot of students think about just sort of completing their common application and then just sort of resubmitting it over and over and over. There's a new set of school-specific essays for a given college, but a lot of students aren't thinking about that common application that's going to all of the colleges, and they're just mindlessly resubmitting that common, that general part of the application to school after school after school after school. It's just not the right mindset, right? It's easy and it's convenient. This has come with a lot of problems, right? And so a lot of students just don't think about this. They think about themselves in a vacuum, but they don't think about themselves relative to the applicant pool. So I'll give a couple of different examples here. One is certainly early decision. A lot of students, or parents, by this point, I've sort of beaten this drum a million times, but with early decision, a student may not like that or something like that because it's a binding commitment, right? And they want to sort of keep their options open. They want maximum optionality. And if there's financial considerations, then I think that that's more excusable. There's a lot more to justify there if there's financial reasons because you don't necessarily get to weigh financial offers. You can do the net price calculator. You can still back out of the binding commitments if the student can't meet your demonstrated financial need. So there's still something to even be said for people who have financial issues, but, you can't it's not like you could apply to 18 schools and see if the kid's gonna get scholarships and then compare all the offers, right, if you do early decision, right? And for some people, that will weigh very significantly, that financial aspect. That's a special case. It's hard for me to take issue with people who have other financial, considerations, right? Because that sort of moves beyond just sort of the strategy and just getting into the colleges. But outside of that, if you don't have those special, factors or variables involved, what ED does is a lot of students don't like it because, it binds them to a certain school. But the thing is that what you're really trying to do in admissions is you're trying to create as many sort of gates. The visual that I would sort of use is like a really high wall, and you want the wall to be as high as possible because if you get over it, then other people it's just not as easy for other people to get over. I talked about this in some earlier episodes. A lot of students, they think, "Oh, this is difficult," but they don't think about the upside of the difficulty, and a lot of times the upside of the difficulty is like a very high wall, but if you can get over the wall, you can also say that because it was very difficult, there are not gonna be as many people who are gonna be behind you, you're gonna also gonna be able to get over the wall, right? And so the fact that it is a binding commitment and it's an honest signal of your interest in the school, and the fact that you do have to give up and sacrifice options, a potential scholarship, that's also what makes it strategically beneficial because there are way fewer students who do it than do regular decision or early action, right? And so I remember talking to a parent a few years ago and they're like, "Oh, this Georgetown restrictive early action, this is amazing because it's not a binding commitment." That plan sucks. That is the worst freaking plan in all of college admissions. It's the worst decision plan in terms of opportunity cost. It blocks you out from ED. You have a higher rate applying regular decision. Like, it is a ridiculous decision plan. But, they went and did, a visit to Georgetown and are like, "Oh, it's not Georgetown." Georgetown's gonna sell you on that. They're gonna be like, "We don't have ED," right? And a lot of the schools that don't have ED and they have single choice early action or restrictive early action, single choice early action in particular, those schools don't have yield problems, right? Like Harvard and Stanford don't have yield problems. Like 85% of the kids come to the school. So like they don't need ED like Cornell, who I don't know what the yield numbers off the top of my head, but 45 to 65% off the top of my head come, take Cornell's offer. So, it's different on an institution by institution basis in terms of what they're trying to solve for. And those institutions might trying to be optimized for a whole bunch of students who are not going to do early decision and they don't want to lose some of those students. So they sort of dangle this single choice early action or restrictive early action. There's really big issues with some of these plans. But a lot of students will look at it, and if I'm Georgetown, I would do the same thing. I'd be like, do ED to Brown or ED to Penn, you gotta go if you get into Penn, right? That sounds terrible. Oh my god, you have to go if you get into Penn. It's the worst thing in the world. Um, but yeah, if I were admissions officer for Georgetown, I would say the same thing. I would be like, "Oh, our plan doesn't." It's like that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to sell you on the benefits. So do the same thing. And I would say we have restrictive early action. You don't have to put in a binding commitment. It's like, oh yeah, but don't you have the same acceptance rate restrictive early action as Yale does? Right? It's like, oh yeah. We are kind of like a top 20 college that basically has the early acceptance rate of a top 5 college, but don't worry about that part, right? It's like, wait, also, don't you have a better chance of getting in regular decision than it's like, yeah, yeah, just, all right, let's like stop the topic now. right? It's like, yeah, I would just sell you on the upsides of the decision plan. So a lot of people just think at a very local level what's best for them, but they don't think about themselves relative to the competition or the other students. And so when you do ED, you have a big relative advantage over all the other students, the other 55, 75, 85, 95,000 applicants who won't do early decision, right? And you have to not think about yourself in a vacuum of, oh, this is difficult, or oh, I don't like this, or oh, I have to make an individual sacrifice. You have to think about it relative to your competition and the applicant pool. Same thing with, super scoring. It's like kids are like, oh, I could super score. Yeah, no kidding. So can all the other kids though too. So it's not as though like you're comparing your super score to somebody else's individual because they can also super score. So that evens out the strategy or the benefit because everybody else can also super score as well, right? And so, and again with difficulty, right? Students just don't interpret difficulty in a way that's conducive to them, which is difficulty in a lot of ways, just an honest signal of saying, there's gonna be fewer people who are gonna do this. The more difficult it is, it's just the less likely it is that other people behind you are going to follow, right? Or gonna be able to do the same thing, right? So, I think a lot of students just don't have this correct mindset. Now, I think there are a lot of problems and a lot of reasons why students don't have this mindset. And for all of the talk, there are all these admissions cliches about stress and competition and all this. I think it's just absolute nonsense and just totally just trying to sugarcoat and put a veneer over this process that is just much more harmful to students than just telling it like it is, which I'm obviously many people know by now, I'm a very big proponent of just telling it like it is. But when we talk about a student who goes to a high school and the school ranks and they're very accustomed to making a lot of decisions, and I understand people don't love this, and it's not even that I 100% love it either. I don't love every aspect of it. But if you go to a large public high school that has 650 students in your grade and the school ranks, you have a lot higher subjective awareness of your competition, the way that you make course selection decisions, the way that your GPA gets weighted, because you have a class ranking and it shows up on your transcript, and it does matter for college admissions. 100% it matters for college admissions, right? And so you need to make a lot of your decisions by thinking relative to your peers because you literally have a number on a piece of paper that keeps reminding you of what your standing is compared to your competition. And for all of the talk, and this is a separate episode, and I won't go into this, and there are other people have podcasts out there who are saying that, class rank is bad because it stresses students out and makes it a competition among peers. Newsflash, it is a competition among your peers. Like, it's just like, what are we talking about here? Like, I just don't understand. Like, I don't understand why people can't just say it's a competition. You are competing against your peers. What do you it's like, what do you want me to tell you? You are competing against your peers. So the student who goes to a large public school that ranks, I think they're much more subjectively aware of the competition, their relative standing compared to their peers and other students in the applicant pool. And then there's some bougie private school that doesn't want to rank any of their students, and those students are less aware. We used to have in our background form for advising. I just changed the question because people just have no idea what they're talking about. But we used to ask people to rank where they stood in their class. And when there's no I mean, if you have class ranking, it's just like it's on the transcript. Like you have perfect visibility into what your standing is. But when schools don't rank, and pretty much none of the private schools, rank, but even a large percentage increasingly of public schools. I forget what the number is. Maybe it's 40% of high schools in the United States rank students. I don't know what it is, but it's diminished over time. But when you ask a lot of people if they were not actually explicitly made aware of their ranking, they vastly overestimated where they ranked in the class in a lot of cases. There's an extreme optimism bias. This is sort of a bit beside I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, as I'm very adept at doing. For certain students, they are just very aware of their relative standing compared to peers, and they think about the admissions process in that way. And that is just honestly in a lot of aspects is actually very conducive because it is actually a competition, right? But then there's a whole bunch of other students and they just don't think about it that way. They don't think I'm writing this essay and then what is sort of the whole distribution of essay responses to this question across the entire applicant pool this year. And then how can I stand out and sort of hedge or move orthogonal to that body of responses? They just don't think like that. And to me, I mean, it just fundamentally doesn't make any sense to me. Probably because I just always thought in a very orthogonal way. I was just always very heterodox, right? Very not orthodox. If you told me everybody was doing X, or you told me that you wanted me to do, I would do Y, right? It's just I always thought like that, and that turns out to be a tremendous asset. I'm in the admissions process because a lot of it is standing out and being unique and having unique value proposition. But a lot of students just don't think this way. And I think the common application is bad on a lot of fronts, and it's very overrated because the value of it is that you get to apply to a lot of colleges and you can use the same application, but that comes with a lot of strategic liabilities. A lot of students now can apply to way more colleges, and so you get all these yield problems. You get, kids submitting way more applications. You get massive inefficiencies in the process as colleges don't know whether the kid's coming or they're just putting in 18 applications. Now this creates sort of this race to the bottom of shotgunning, and now kids are putting in, now it's 18 applications, now it's 19 applications, now it's 20 applications, right? And all this is facilitated by the common application, and just the fact that when you remove barriers to entry, it invites everybody in. And so if you're, again, thinking about it from a very individualistic perspective, and to sort of say you have to jump over this high wall, you're like, "Oh, that sucks. I have to jump over the high wall," but the high wall keeps other people out, right? And so Georgetown very recently announced that it was gonna move over to the common application, and Georgetown used to get, it gets, like, maybe 27,000 applicants a year, and Northeastern gets, like, 95,000, right? Why does Georgetown get 27,000? Because they have a whole entirely different application, terrible application. I mean, it's like looks like it's from the Stone Ages. I joked in a newsletter once that, it looks like it was written by, like, a Jesuit priest, the application, like, using HTML, like, in 98 on, like, a dial-up modem in the university library. The application is so out of date. I mean, the PDF doesn't print the right things. Like, it is just very antiquated, and students would have to sort of start from scratch. You could use some components from the common application, but it was a little annoying. But that barrier to entry, or that individual difficulty, it also screened for the most motivated applicants for Georgetown. And that's why they didn't move over to the common application. But there's always all of these pressures and emissions to have more applicants, to lower your acceptance rates. Georgetown's acceptance rate isn't that impressive. Like, there are colleges that have, half to a third of Georgetown's acceptance rate. They're also screening in a lot of ways at the top of the funnel, where those colleges are not screening at the top of the funnel, right? So anybody can apply to Stanford, even though they have no chance in the world of getting in. They can still apply to Stanford, or Harvard, or all of these schools, right? Another big issue with the American education system is that there's just not enough honest feedback about who's competitive for which schools, and this just doesn't happen in a lot of the rest of the world. You just have a much more clear standing of whether you're competitive or not for the college, and there's just a lot more barriers and strictures around the process that there are not in the U.S. education system. So with the common application, it's just not great inviting that number of applicants. It's not great, this mindset for the process. It's not great even thinking of just having one application that you don't even think at all about in terms of the context of specific schools. You have to be thinking on an incremental school by school basis. So you can resubmit a different version of your common application, the core of the application, to each college. I am not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that students do that. I'm not suggesting you come up with an entirely new personal essay or personal statement, as everybody still incorrectly keeps referring to it as. It's not called the personal statement. This changed a while ago. It's called the personal essay. I'm not saying that you want to submit like a unique version of your personal essay. It's just too much work, right? But to say that you shouldn't be reviewing each version of your common application or each iteration before you hit the submit button for a given school, right? So you can see the school specific portion, but then you can see your common app. You shouldn't just say to yourself, well, I finished the common application in August, and now, I'm only going to review the school specific portion when I incrementally submit each application for each given school. No, you always want to review the entire PDF of 30 pages, right? So you always want to keep looking at your comment, because you always just want to make sure that there's nothing that's extremely incongruent or extremely redundant, because the school specific part that's appended will keep changing. right? So you always want to look at it still in the context of how the admissions officer is going to be viewing it, right? Which is they're going to review that foundational common part of the application, and then they're going to review the school specific portion after that. But you want to reviewing it as I'm submitting this to Duke. Let me review my core common application, and then let me review the Duke supplements, right? I'm submitting it to Brown. Let me review the common application in the context because you're adding something at the end of it, and that might have implications for what came before. So it could just be that a school has 5 essay questions and you happen to hit a certain theme like way too many times, but only way too many times if you consider what you put in all of the main common application. But one school might only give you 2 essays and you didn't hit that theme. You can't with 2 essays really hit a theme too much. But when you get a school that asks you 5 or 6 essay questions and then it was in your, activities, I mean, it's like you put it 9 million as an additional frame. It's like you want to be able to see the whole picture. It's like if there's parts of the puzzle that are changing and there are pieces that are moving around, you still want to see the whole picture of the application. And so a lot of students just don't think this way. And also just don't even know that you can actually incrementally change your common application for each time that you submit it to a college. Again, I'm not saying that you need to do that, but you do need to at least be cognizant of that fact. And you need to be in the mindset of every single time you hit the submit button, it's going to a unique school and they only see that version of the application, right? And I think the common application has not done students justice in terms of this mindset. And I think it's also created this local level perception of advantage. At an individual level, this is making your life easier. The problem is also making everybody else's life easier. And this is where you get all these strategic downfalls, such as way too many applicants, way too many people submitting applications, students who are potentially stealing spots that would not have applied unless it were easy. They wouldn't have applied to Georgetown. But now in the future, they're going to apply to Georgetown and they're not very serious applicants, but they might have the credentials to go to Georgetown. And they're going to take away a spot from somebody who actually was extremely serious about Georgetown. And they would have done the unique Georgetown application because they were motivated to do so. And it would have the extra barrier to entry would have kept the other students out of the Georgetown application because it was too much work and it actually showed that they weren't really as interested in going to Georgetown. So in terms of the common app, you want to be thinking on a school by school basis. You do not want to be thinking about a common application. Every single time you apply to a college, you need to adapt your hook to that college, right? So that college will have certain majors, have certain minors, certain certificates, whatever it is, concentrations, whatever the college calls them. You'll have certain clubs, certain extracurriculars, certain researchers, certain professors, certain activities. You need to be incrementally thinking about how your hook and your candidacy and all the parts of your application, how they are calibrated to that school. And a lot of that will occur in the incremental school specific portions and the school specific essays for sure. But you still need to have that overall mindset for the entire application, that each one is something unique that you are submitting to each one of those colleges. Next overrated aspect, filling up your activities list in the common application. As we are just talking about the common application. And so I've mentioned this on a previous podcast a couple episodes ago. A student we had maybe 4 years ago, and she was a really top-notch applicant. She was probably marginally competitive for, I would say, like top 5, the Yale tier of colleges. And she ended up applying much lower because she just happened to love a school that was more of a, and I'm just using this for just to give people a sense. I'm not trying to invest everything in, US news rankings or just the top this or the top that, but most people would consider this college more of a top 25, top 30 college. It just happened to be the school that she loved the most, and she ended up BDing and getting in. That was mostly her decision. She had a really exceptional, really interesting resume, hook. There were a lot of things that just made it excellent. She had a very unique personal motivation or driving force for her hook, which is just not something that you're always going to have. I would strongly suggest that students consider that. If you have had, some students have had, a certain eye condition, they've had some adversity in their family, that's a potential research topic or research area. If you have something that is personal that can also motivate the academic, it is extremely powerful because it's an honest signal. If you have a student who is doing research in a field or a topic that is extremely personally meaningful to them, it provides a lot of extra firepower for the legitimacy of the narrative. but it also just it's a more coherent picture because it sort of ties together both the personal and the academic, which is a lot of what you're strategically trying to do in the application anyway. A lot of people focus too much on the personal, which I'll get into in a little bit, and some people focus too much on the academic, and really a lot of it is a personalized insight. It needs to have some personality. Like, I need to see that you love learning and that you love your field, right? You don't wanna be too boring and transactional. There are a lot of students like that, right? They don't really have an issue with the hook or being very focused versus the well-rounded student who's just sort of the academic generalist. But the problem with that student is a lot of times they're just boring. Like, they're just a lot of them just lack interpersonal skills. Like, they're what I refer to a lot of times as intellects, but not doers. And that student has their liabilities as the student who's a doer, right? The doer needs to be a little bit more intellectual, and the intellect needs to be a little bit more of a doer. And so a lot of that does turn on sort of, I would say sort of introversion and extroversion, and then also like just inherent intellectual curiosity. If you're the student who sort of would read the encyclopedia for fun in your bedroom, you're more the intellect. And if you're the student who's sort of more of the leader and leverages, your interpersonal skills, and you're sort of more out there, and you like to work with people versus, concepts or machines, you're more of the doer archetype. And then that also tracks certain fields, right? So I would generally say that people are going to be more, like hardcore basic science or engineering, generally a little bit more, maybe intellect side. A student who's going to be in business or marketing, like more doer traits. There's more of a person at the center of a lot of what they do. So in terms of, filling up your activities list here, and this past student, she had a really, really impressive resume, but, she also had a lot of real just, like, fluff in her resume, and so she wrote a first draft of her activities list, and it looked like the activities list of a student who was applying to maybe, like, top 100 colleges or something, or top, I don't know, top 50, top 75, and this is a student who had a resume was clearly a top 5 to top 10 resume, and the problem was she had really impressive activities, in the resume, but then she had a whole bunch of just, like, filler and just stuff that was just not interesting, not unique, not relevant, and just low value. So she had a lot of sports in there. To her credit, she built an extremely impressive resume while also partaking in a lot of sports. She was just so motivated, and just a very high flying kid and was able to pull it off. A lot of students can't, and there's some major opportunity cost, but she happened to pull it off. And so it was just a lot of stuff that was dragging down. It was diluting the quality of the activities list. And you don't want to fall into this trap. If you have 7 amazing activities, that are all related to your hook and are pretty high value, or at least like mid to higher value, like really good contributions, sort of niche and unique and relevant. You don't want to start just diluting one of two aspects. You don't want to dilute the relevance, which is the relevance to the hook or the overall theme or the through line of the application, what field you're applying for. You don't want to dilute that, and then you also don't want to dilute just the overall value. So if you have much higher value activities, meaning you made higher contributions or you had, relevant leadership, you don't then want to start putting things like member of a club, so it's again, if you're applying for anthropology and you're the member of the Key Club or the member of the Friendlies Club or the member of the newspaper, and it's like you never wrote any newspaper topics about anthropology. It's just like if it's not relevant and it's low value, you want to consider omitting it from the application altogether. And I gave another example. I mentioned this at least in 2 out of the last 3 episodes. The student who played varsity golf and was on the golf team for 4 years, and we told him just don't put this in the application. Like, it's just he had a ton of much higher value activities, much more impressive relevant activities. And, even though I know it stinks and you're sort of like, oh, I did golf for all of these years and I'm on the varsity golf team and, I might be a captain in the spring. It's just like, are you Tiger Woods? No. It's just like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're not playing golf at the college. It doesn't matter. It's diluting the themes of the application. It's diluting the relevance. It's diluting the value, right? This is not high value. This is not a high value activity. There are a ton of kids who play golf. I also mentioned the social, perceptual factors of a kid who goes to a private school from an overrepresented minority background. It was adding a net negative to his application in reality, right? But you want to be very careful of this dilutionary effect in your application. And this again is this tendency to not take the admissions officer's perspective. So what a lot of students do and a lot of parents do is they, again, kitchen sink syndrome. It's like, let me throw as much information as possible at these people. You don't want to do that. You want to think about the ratio or the concentration of the value and the relevance of the information, right? If you have, I don't know anything about wine, but if you had a really nice bottle of wine and you pour into a glass and then you start, just pouring tap water into it. Like that's essentially what a lot of people do in their applications, right? They're just diluting down the stuff that's really valuable. And what you're also doing is you're just overloading an admissions officer with less important information. So now it starts diluting the theme. It's easier to forget. It's not as easy to understand what you represent. Not clear what your very unique value proposition is because you're messing things in that aren't you're looking less impressive because you have some really impressive stuff, but then you're putting in just garbage in your application, all so that you would just fill up your 10 activities in your activities list for your additional information section, right? Now, if you're the student who has 10 amazing activities and you have just all these, super special research projects and organizations and publications and patents, and you got to put them in the additional information section, so you load up that's fine. I'm not saying leave out information that's highly relevant or high value to your application, but don't be putting in stuff where it's a club and it's just if there's even something in there, right? Again, if the kid were applying for anthropology and they were on the school newspaper and they were maybe only a member, first of all, you might try to just repackage or reframe some of these terms to make them just sound a little bit better. So I did this in the Stanford application review episode where I sort of just some of these terms that you use, a student would say something like, I shadowed somebody, or it's just such a bad, low value, unimpressive way of describing something. You might have to finesse this a little bit, what your title is, but generally try to avoid member or just something that's like very passive. You got to brand it as best as you possibly can. But if you are the anthropology kid and you did do the newspaper, you had no real, maybe leadership, but maybe you wrote a couple of articles about anthropology for the newspaper. Okay, that's not bad, right? That could be number. It depends on how impressive your resume is, right? For a kid who doesn't have an amazing resume, it might be like number 5. For a kid who has an exceptional resume, it might not even be in any of the top 10. It might be an overflow in the initial information section, extra activity. Again, you have to always think very carefully about any, additional information section. It's optional. It's not something, so you do need to make sure that's pretty high value. So that'd be a very questionable call. But it'd be further down the activities list potentially, or additional information section, or if a kid just had such an amazing resume, it just wouldn't be mentioned at all potentially. But if it did have some relevance and you only have sort of 4 really impressive relevant activities, then yeah, it might go in there. And there is sort of some cutoff, right? I wouldn't say that you want to be putting in MIT's application is obviously different. I'm talking about the common application, and then for the UCs, it gets even worse because it's 20. But if you're in the common application, like you probably generally need to have 6 or 7 at least. But just be careful about is you're gonna be adding 9 and 10, and it's like, I was a member of the JV soccer team. It's just like, come on, what are you doing? Like, it's just not relevant. It's not impressive. It's not high value. Consider leaving it out when it doesn't check any of those boxes. Just consider not absorbing the dilutionary effect of this information in your application. Obviously, it's very hard for me to specifically comment on everybody's application. It all depends on how impressive is the student's resume, how many do they actually have, but don't just don't be in the mindset of I need to add 9 and 10 to the common application or 8, 9, and 10, or on the UCs like 17, 18, 19, and 20. If it's just you're throwing garbage in there. You're trying to top up the glass of wine with just, tap water or something from the water fountain. It's just not necessarily the great idea. So think very carefully about that. Next aspect or tactic that is very overrated is in-person opportunities for the resume building process, especially over the summer. So as I move through this process and I observe our team and our students and our program, you just learn more and more, and you learn about just things that you never even thought about, or just why people make this mistake, or why they think about things in the wrong way that never occurred to you before. And just anytime you're sort of teaching or coaching, it's just you sort of have these different moments, and you're like, oh, this is why the student never understood this, or this is why they always make this mistake on the ACT, whatever it is, right? You learn these things over time. One thing that I've learned over time is in terms of how a lot of people think about their summer. is there are a lot of problems because people have other commitments in some cases. They don't leave a clean slate in terms of opportunities, which can be problematic for the student's candidacy building. Because again, if you're actually building a resume in the way that you should, you're always aggregating opportunities. Now, you might be getting higher value opportunities or new novel ones, or you might have gone into like an actually extremely top notch, high value summer program. I mentioned some of these in the tree about summer programs. There's some that are actually truly differentiating. It's just that 98% of them are not. You need to have kind of a blank slate in terms of your summers. Like if your family's traveling and you want to have access, or you're going to be in the mountains somewhere or whatnot, like that causes a lot of problems. And what I've seen can be a little bit of an issue in terms of logistics with families is a lot of people try to plan out their summer, maybe in the winter, but the student then can get an opportunity, or they start the advising process, later on in the spring or right before the summer. It's like, we need you to like be able to have free time over the summer to like now capitalize on that Yale researcher just like sent you an email and invited you to work with them. And they're like, oh yeah, it was like, I'm going to be, who knows where for like 8 weeks with no internet access. And you're just like, oh, that's great. So we can't capitalize on this opportunity at all. Amazing. There's a lot of things that I've realized about the summer planning. One thing is I think people just have too much of a structured, very rigid view of the summer. It's just programs, all structure. It's just a lot of an extension of the school year, basically, right? It's like everybody wants to have an itinerary. And it's like, I get that. It's like, we're extremely structured people as well. We want to have a plan, we want to have that, but it's like, that doesn't always work with the nature of the resume building and the college admissions process if you're doing it in an optimal way. There's definitely going to be trade-offs if you always need structure to everything and you can't, sort of keep a little bit of an open slate to allow to be flexible to opportunities as they keep coming in and evolving over time for the student. So there are all these things that I've thought about over the summer. Another thing that I just realized is there are some students and even parents might sort of push this, but they really want to do something in person, right? And so I was talking to a girl maybe last year, the spring, and she was sort of like, I want to do in person lab research, over the summer going into senior year. And it's like, great, you can do this research opportunity that's 40 hours a week for 8 weeks over the summer. And that's the only thing you'll be able to do. Right. And the problem with that is that might sound great on certain fronts, right? So for one, it's definitely a very deep commitment. There is some extent to which you could say that a student who's doing 40 hours, they have a higher probability potentially of getting a higher output of that research, maybe ending up on a publication because they were more involved. But that's always suspect anyway. And she's a senior applying to college. So the publication turnaround is just not going to be there. It's not like you're going to submit that project, those studies, and it's gonna be published by November 1st in time for the students' early out. It's just like, that's not the timeline for research being published. So it's like, that wasn't gonna be an ROI anyway, and so you have this massive, extremely precluding time commitment, and it's very logistically precluding, right? It's just to be in person, in the lab, 40 hours, like so basically is gonna be all-encompassing, right? And then you have all your applications over the summer. And a lot of people, I just realized they just don't think about this, or just because the student wants to be in person, right? It's just like they don't want to be home alone over the summer because, like, the parents, this is another one that I heard recently. It's like the student, their parents were traveling, and so the kid was going to be home alone. It's like, I get it. Like, I get it as a human being or as a kid. You might not want to be working from a laptop. And I think this has been like just a little bit of a shock to think about over time because my mindset and the mindset of our team we're a remote company, right? My mindset as an entrepreneur is like, you give me an internet connection and like I can do anything from anywhere in the world, right? And I love that flexibility. I love that entrepreneurial nature of I don't need to go to a cubicle, I don't need to drive to work every day and like have a boss hovering over me to get the job done 9 to 5. Like I've never thought that way, right? And I think a lot of the admissions process, if you're doing it in the way that is optimal and producing the best outcomes, I actually think that frame and that mindset is actually extremely beneficial to students. If you have to think, and this is one of my big issues with summer programs, is I think they set up an external locus of control. It's like, I have to get into this summer program. I have to apply by its deadlines. It's like, no, it's a very scarcity based mindset. And we like our students think very abundantly with a very high internal locus of control. It's like, I can create value anywhere. I can contribute to this club. I could email these people. Like, to me, that's a much more empowering view of yourself and of the world, right? And your relationship to the world. And so it just like never even occurred to me that there were a whole bunch of students or parents who are sort of like, oh, the kid has to be in person. This is sort of a maybe a bit of an unfortunate part of the process, but I don't know what people expect. But you have to make sacrifices. And so for the students that I talk to, and this is one thing that I'm looking at, is for the student who's like, we tell them that between two things, the remote thing gives them a lot more flexibility. It has lower opportunity costs. They'll be able to add a second, third, fourth activity over the summer because there's very marginal gains past you. So an admissions officer sees 1 hour a week versus 15 hours a week. That's a huge delta in terms of the perception of your depth and your commitment. But the difference between 15 hours a week and 40 hours a week, it's almost a 3x in terms of your time commitment and getting close to like precluding almost all of your time, especially if it's in-person commitment. Like you can't really do just about anything else. Certainly if you're going into senior year and you're doing all of your applications on top of that. But the delta there in terms of the value, it just doesn't make sense for the marginal opportunity cost. In certain conditions or certain cases where there's a very high output and there's not a lot of risk there, then the risk reward dynamic might change, but it's almost never happens that there's such a certain ROI of something that you can volunteer a kid to take up their entire summer in that thing, especially when you're in the later stages of the process. That you can take up your entire summer in person and basically do nothing else. Like there's almost just nothing. There are some things that are extremely, 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 extremely high value. Like we had a student who was doing just like a perfectly niche engineering project at a top college with the dean of engineering at that school who was going to write him a letter of recommendation. And this is not like, I have a family friend who's the dean of engineering at this school. It's like, no, he was doing research with the person who like literally reads the applications. He was doing research, somebody very high value at the school, a higher up, very niche project directly in the theme, and it was going to be an ED school. So that is a very specialized case. And, but the vast majority of cases are not like that, where you're going to have a very significant, clearly high value, and then also just additional benefits, like it's calibrated to the school that the kid's EDing to, working with somebody who's very high value in their own right, and going to be very, helpful and conducive in the admissions process. Almost no opportunities are really like that. And so it's just very hard to justify any commitment. It's going to take up your entire summer, just one singular commitment. But for the student, who's like, we tell them, the remote is better than the in-person and you could do a lot of research remotely. And they're just thinking about a lab context where they have to do everything in the lab. So you could do a million things remotely, right? As long as you find somebody who's willing to do that, you data analysis, you literature review. There's a lot of stuff you could do remotely, right? And now you can also do 3 or 4 other things as well. So you can also build your resume. But for the student who's just like, oh, I have to do it in person. It's like, that's the student who's just not willing to do what it takes because they're optimizing for alternative goals, right? The student who says, I want to optimize for my candidacy and I understand the strategic part of this process and the opportunity costs, and so I'll do the remote thing, right? That's a student who's just going to have a much bigger advantage in this process because they're willing to make the sacrifices of saying, yeah, like, I wish that I could do something in person. Like, it's going to be a little bit lonely, with just my laptop or whatever. But those are the sacrifices that you make. Those are the trade-offs that you make for this thing that you say you really want that is very difficult to obtain, which is admission to one of these colleges. And if you don't really want it, and that's how you actually know if the student wants it, right? That's how you actually know. There are all these people out there who are like, my kid's so motivated. My kid, and it's like you talk to the kid, oh, I'm motivated. I'm motivated. I don't care about how much you say you're motivated. Your motivation needs to get operationalized. One of the best ways to operationalize motivation is what you will give up, what you will sacrifice, right? Because unless you really want something, you won't make most of those sacrifices, right? It's like, it's like if I said to somebody, hey, do you want to be an amazing figure skater, right? They're looking at the Winter Olympics, right? It's like how many people tune to the Winter Olympics that watch the figure skaters, right? And it like looks amazing. It's like, Yeah, it's like if I said, you'd snap your fingers and be an amazing figure skater, I'm sure most people would sign themselves up for it. But then if you actually showed the training and the years of training and difficulty and injuries and cuts and torn this and torn, it's like people were like, yeah, that's not worth it to me, right? And that's totally fine, right? But the great thing about life is we get to pick whether it's worth it, right? And everything has a price tag, right? And so a lot of students, they just won't do what it takes or what's necessary to give themselves the best chance, and that shows that they don't want it as much as somebody else does, unfortunately. I hate to say it, but there are kids who want it more, and there are kids who want it less. So, if you can't sacrifice some in-person time or some logistic rigidity or opportunity cost, or you're the parents, and I think a lot of this also might be conditioned by COVID, that there was the asynchronous learning that didn't go as well, and there's sort of this pushback on asynchronous or remote or virtual stuff from COVID. That's teaching, right? That's very different, right? It's a lot different when you're teaching kids math, right? And it's like you can't just apply that to everything, and you also have to weigh the pros and the cons, right? It's like if a student's only gonna be able to get an opportunity and it's remote, and it fits in their niche and it's perfect and it's high value and it's with an amazing it's like, you have to weigh all of those things and you have to weigh the opportunity cost of in-person commitments. And so one of, again, the most overrated aspects, just circling back to the main point here, so I keep going on tangents, is in-person commitments I think are very overrated. And if you are that rigid, either as a parent or as a student, those are your choices, right? It's like if you have to do the in-person thing, and you're just going to make certain trade-offs, it's just not, that's not how we approach it, right? It's like we're just always thinking the most strategic, and so we're always going to be thinking there's only one North Star, which is what optimizes the student's candidates. And it's very simple, right? It's like a whole bunch of companies, whole bunch of firms, a whole bunch of people, they're optimizing for like 48 different things, right? It's like I'm optimizing for financial considerations and I'm optimizing for, this problem, and then it's like great, you could work with those people, but it's like they have no North Star for all of their tactics, right? It's like there's one North Star. The job is to keep as many options on the table for as long as we possibly can and to get you into the best school as possible. And you have to be willing to make all the sacrifices and all of the commitments in that direction, or we don't want to work with you. And most people don't have that standard for working with students, but there are some people who do, especially if you wanted to go hire somebody who's the best of the best in a certain field, you want to work the best of the best as a mentor, they're not taking anybody, and they're not just gonna be like, oh, this person's kind of serious, or they'll kind of make the sacrifice, but sometimes it's like, no, they want a blank slate. They want to know that when I tell you to do something, you do it, right? And then you go above and beyond, right? And you're willing to be flexible and do what it takes. And that's totally fine if you don't and you have to do all the in-person, and there's only an opportunity cost if there's other stuff. Obviously, if you've no alternatives or no other opportunities, but a lot of students should be trying to get remote opportunities because they can sit adjacent to each other in parallel, and it's just more powerful resume building. So, very overrated in-person commitments. And there's a lot of liabilities. Now, of course, there's scale to this. If it's a 1 week program and it's in person, and you can still work on your laptop and do your other stuff because you have another project going on with a professor, or you're planning club stuff for the upcoming year or some initiative, that's fine. And that's obviously a lot less of an opportunity cost, right? But I think a lot of people put too much into in person. A lot of people are too much in their preferences, when their preferences, if they want to really maximize their missions odds, your preference of in-person versus remote, I hate to tell you, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter, right? It's like, if you wanna be a great figure skater or an Olympian, would you prefer to eat, ice cream versus it's like, yeah, no kidding, I'm sure they would prefer to eat it, but that's not going to help them accomplish the goal. And so just getting very clear on how serious you are about this goal. And I love people. I'm super glad. All of the kids in our advising program are super glad that there's a whole bunch of kids out there who won't make those sacrifices and who won't do it and whose preferences will trump what it takes to actually win. They love that. I love that because we're going to beat you. Right. And so it's just great. Give up as many. competitive advantages as you possibly can because you're not as serious motivated. And I think that's fine. And I think there's only so many things in life that you can make these trade-offs for, that you're willing to really go all in and say, I'm a blank slate and I'm flexible and I'm willing to give up my preferences. I'm willing to give up a Saturday night, a Friday night with my friends. I'm willing to make the sacrifices because I want this thing so much. And that's how I actually define how much you really, really want it, is like, how much are you willing to sacrifice? There are some kids out there who are just so passionate and they lucked out and they just love what they love so much that it's not even a sacrifice for them. Like, that's the thing that they would prefer to do over everything else. And congratulations to those kids. And you certainly want to listen to that. And we look for that as much as we possibly can. But make no mistake, it's basically impossible, particularly over multiple years, that you're not going to have to subjugate some preference or make some sacrifice or do something that you don't want to do or listen to somebody who's an expert who's telling you something that you think is wrong or you heard something out, whatever. Like, it's just, it's not reality. Like, you are going to still have to make sacrifices. Even the kid who is super passionate about something and they love it and they want to build their resume around it, and you don't even need to tell them, this is like that they would be spending all their time doing that anyway. Even that kid, when they get to the essays, they may want to write about this topic, but you tell them to write about that topic because that the topic's basically, there's always going to be trade-offs and sacrifices. And I think that a lot of people get into all these arguments because the things that they would make the trade-offs for this, like, they're like, I wouldn't sacrifice or I wouldn't make that trade-off. It's like, great, so don't. Who cares? But don't delude yourself that you're going to get the same outcome as the person who is willing to make the trade-offs and the sacrifices. And so this is a whole different topic for another episode, but you need to be very clear about your little preferences about in-person versus remote and understand that there are a lot of strategic consequences and implications for your candidacy. And so you need to take these into account. Okay, next up, grammar. When it comes to the application, so a lot of you, your rising seniors, were a little crazy. Time definitely flies here. We're in June already. So a lot of people basically are in the summer and are at this point now rising seniors. So for those students in particular, you're obviously now coming up with the application process, a lot of these essays. Two things that I think are highly overrated in terms of essays are a focus on grammar, particularly a lot of parents put a lot of emphasis on grammar. And then also the essay being personal, right? And this is a lot of people but done a significant disservice because the personal essay is called the personal essay and it has a whole bunch of prompts that are very personal leaning. And so I would strongly encourage, particularly if you're new to this podcast, because we are sort of crossing years and application cycles. There's a new influx of people who were not maybe listening in the fall, last summer, last spring when we started the podcast. I would strongly encourage you, if you are a rising senior or have a rising senior, to go back and listen to the biggest college essay mistake episode that we had. It was in the first 8 or 10 episodes or so, but just a very short synopsis of that episode. The biggest college essay mistake in a nutshell is for students specifically applying to the top and most highly selective colleges, not applying to number 250 or number 185 or number, it just, 96, right? And so I differentiate in that episode students are applying to the most selective colleges versus what the common application serves, which is hundreds of colleges, including colleges that have 90% acceptance rates, right? And so again, when we talk about sort of being niche or being, you know, optimized towards a specific avatar and problem, it's like this, we are niche and towards a specific avatar on this podcast, which is, this is a podcast for people, parents of or students who are applying to the most selective colleges in the US. And of course you can take aspects, certainly what works for Harvard will work for American University, but what works for American University will not work for Harvard. It only works in one direction. You can go top down, but you can't go from the bottom up, basically, right? And so one of the problems with the common application and the personal essay is the common application serving hundreds upon hundreds of member institutions of all different selectivity types. And I go into detail in that episode about, if you write some personal essay, I mean, I if you're applying to a top 100 college and you have a 35 ACT score, you could probably write your application in crayon and you would still get in. There's just very different layers of selectivity and standards for students. If you have amazing metrics for all but, top 50 or so college, like you can get, if you're applying to a top 125 college and you have a really strong GPA and really strong test scores, you can get in on the basis of that because they don't have enough applicants who have that. The problem is the top colleges have no shortage of those students who all have those metrics. And so they need to look at other factors as well on top of those, right? And so the competitiveness of an institution's always going to scale, or the factors that are sort of considered to differentiate a student are always going to scale up. It's if everybody has the first three factors in common and they all have, strong course rigor, strong grades, and strong test scores, then I need to go to factor four because I need something to differentiate them. And then when they all have the first four in common, then you go to five, then you go to six, then you go to seven. But I need to get to something that's eventually going to cause some variable or some differentiation because I have a differentiated outcome. I can't take all of them. In that episode, I go into the personal essay. I think is a misnomer because the personal essay will not. If you write a purely personal essay, it is not strategically the most advantageous. What a lot of top colleges are looking for, as we've adequately covered, is they're looking for students who have focused academic passions, who have a hook, who have that academic through line, and that does need to be represented in the biggest, in a lot of ways, the most important. I hesitate to say most important, um, because all the essays are important in your application. The school-specific supplements are extremely important for motivating your very particular interest in that college. But that personal essay is the longest piece. It is the centerpiece of your application. A lot of ways, it is the cover letter of your application, the centerpiece for your application. So it is extremely important, and it does need to spotlight your hook. And what a lot of students will not do, they will not spotlight their hook because the title of the essay is not it's just not appropriate. It's a personal essay. There's a lot of personal prompts. And so the kid will end up talking about something that's purely personal, and they won't talk about their hook or their academic through line at all. And it's not that you don't want there to be personal parts of that essay. You do want there to be personal parts, but you want it to be, and I cover this in length in the episode, you want there to be a personalized insight into your passions and your academics. So you need to have both components. You have the personal and the academic, the hook and the relevance part, right? It needs to be something like an origin story of how you discovered your interest, or maybe some key inflection point in the development of your interest, or some key, discovery along the lines, and it should feel like this kid genuinely loves this area, or had to maybe overcome some adversity in this area, or something wasn't going right. It should be a story, right? Which a lot, I think, does track with the more personal nature. It should not be a technical exposition, so it should not be overly academic. It's not the tone of a additional information section or an activities list, which is very objective, neutral, factual tone. It does need to be a narrative, right? So, but it needs to be a synthesis of both of these aspects, the personal and the academic, right? It needs to have certainly some narrative. It's not just a dry technical exposition, right? But it does need to have some of the technical aspects, not overly technical, right? Because it's still just being written for a lay admissions officer. Uh, so it needs to be a balance, right? But I think a lot of people in the applications, particularly I see parents all the time, it's like they're thinking about the essays as vehicles for like they're, like, viewing it as though it's like a family photo book album or something, right? It's like, this essay is, like, really who Johnny is, and, like, it doesn't this might sound bad, but, like, that's not what you're trying to accomplish, right? You're trying to get into the college. The measuring stick for the essays is not, like, whether you as a parent are proud of, like, how true and authentic it is to Johnny's. Ideally, it is, right? Ideally it is, but people will sort of be talking about like, the parent will be, there was this thing that happened and like I think it shows their personality and it's like this has nothing to do with anything. This doesn't go in the application, right? And there's just a difference between what's personally important to you or significant or to your family and what actually makes for the best application content. And sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. And for people who want a little bit more in depth and a little bit more, because I know I'm sort of sometimes talking and people are like, we'll give, a very specific example, application strategy with a high school senior episode that we did back in the fall. That student was talking about a community they belong to. This is a very common school supplement, like what's a community you belong to. And so we actually had them write out a whole bunch of discovery questions. You don't didn't have them write out the actual like final draft essays, but did a whole bunch of discovery questions. And we used that community one because it's a very common college essay question. They wrote about the church that they belong to, and the problem with that answer is like that might be personally meaningful to the kid. And you can write about whatever you want. Again, nobody ever has to listen to me. I say this all the time. Like this is just a phrase that I like to use a lot is this is a documentary, it's not a sermon, right? This is not I'm giving my experiences, our team's experiences, having done this process at what I believe, not to toot our horn, is I believe at or very near the highest level that anybody is doing this, and I think our outcomes reflect that. You don't have to listen, and we obviously take a very strategic, high agency approach to this process, which may be off-putting to certain people, or they don't want to make the sacrifice or the trade-off, or they wanna tell the kid that, they should be able to have every weekend and also go to Harvard, which is ridiculous. It's just whatever. You can do whatever you want. Like you don't have to make the trade-offs, you don't have to make the sacrifices. You don't have to do the more strategic thing. I'm only here to convey the things that I believe and that we have evidence for have worked the best and have been extremely effective. Right. So you can write about whatever you want. And I told that student, because we were doing it in the episode, and I was basically talking to the student. They weren't on the episode, but some people will remember this episode. Some people might want to go back. It's called Application Strategy with a High School Senior. Um, I just said to the student, I'm talking to everybody in the audience, but I'm also talking to the student. It's like, this could be very personally meaningful to you, this response of I'm part of, my church community. But it's just not the most differentiating or unique content, right? It's just like if I were to draw up like a list of all the most common responses to that question among the applicant pool and to look at the distribution, it would be like church would be like very high or some religious community or ethnic community or whatever it is, and it's just like it's not what the process is. If you're trying to be strategic or trying to stand out, you're trying to stand out in a sea of applications, not to blend in with a sea of applications. So you do need to think very seriously about what everybody else is saying and then to try hedge against that and say something different. If again, and this is a big if, which never even really dawned on me until years later that people wouldn't want to just optimize unilaterally, for this. It's just like, I don't know. It's like you're hiring us as experts of the process. Like, seems like you probably would be extremely sick. But it's like there are people who don't want to make again, don't want they will not they want to write the essay about the church. So it's just like write the essay about the church. It's just like, I don't know, it's like just informed consent. It's just telling you it's probably not the best strategic idea. And a lot of times what you're hoping to get is that a lot of kids, like they might have really good authentic answers that are personally meaningful to them and they're also strategic. Those are in difficult cases, right? Like the kid who loves food systems and agriculture, that we've had in our program, who like there's just like their first and foremost passion. It's like it is authentic and is strategic at the same time, but, like, everybody's not like that. Other people have tensions, and they will be caught between the thing that is the most, quote, unquote, "authentic," whatever that means, and, the, quote, unquote, "most strategic," right? I have a big problem with the authenticity because it sets up a whole bunch of issues of, like, what is a human being? What is this kid? You're not like one thing. You have a million different contextual slices. Like this is one contextual slice. It doesn't mean that it's inauthentic. It's just we're taking one of the more parts that are authentic, but also happen to strategically work so that we don't have to have you take an admissions hit and have like just a pure trade-off between authenticity and strategy. Right? I'm a big fan of strategic authenticity, which like trying to get both at the same time, right? So it's like there's a million different versions of you. How about we just pick the subset of them that also happen to be strategic as well, so we can have it both ways instead of putting them at odds with each other and saying, you know, your parents want you to talk about this topic because like, it makes them cry or they're really proud of, this thing that you did that has nothing to do with your college applications. It could be a total strategic lie, but also try to do the thing that is not like we're not make things up. We're not going to lie, but it's also strategic and going to get the job done because I imagine you're probably not writing these essays as like a family memento or as like an autobiography in the first place. I pretty much imagine that you would not be writing these essays unless you wanted to go to one of these colleges. So like that is sort of the frame for measuring everything is what's going to get the job done? Because why are you writing these essays in the first place anyway? You wouldn't have volunteered yourself to write these essays. Like nobody would for fun. There's a big issue with just overly personal topics. It does need to be, in a lot of cases, a synthesis. These have some personality and personalized insight and narrative, particularly in the personal essay. The supplements are a little bit more, they don't have to be as crazy of sort of the storytelling and the narrative. You just don't have as much space. But the personal essay is a big one where a lot of people trip up because it's just they go too much down the personal and there's not enough of the academic. Grammar is another one, very overrated. Personal, overly personalized themes or responses in the essay is very overrated. Grammar, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's just like, again, we have a podcast for students applying to top colleges. Like if you don't have correct grammar, it's just what are you doing applying to your top college anyway? So you have Grammarly, you have all these resources. I mean, I don't even know what the average number of people is that look through a student's applications before they submit them, but I mean, they have teachers, they have their counselor in school. If they don't have, private counselor, but like it's just like you have parents, you have so many people who are potentially looking at a student's applications. Like it just goes without saying that like you should have, correct grammar, but it's just like that's such a basic rudimentary part of the essays that, and then, you get parents who are involved and they're sort of, then they're like a little too obsessive when they're like tweaking things that start not looking like the students or like putting like unbeknownst in the essay. It's like, oh, tell me your dad's a lawyer without telling me that your dad's a lawyer. Like it's like this 17-year-old doesn't talk like this. They don't put unbeknownst in their essays. So the writing and the technical, basically, it needs to be compelling. It's definitely a very important part of it, but the content and, again, specifically related to the hook and the academic through line is where just a lot of people, have gone wrong in the past. They write overly personal essays. Great, your essay is like perfectly grammatically correct, but like the person that you have helping you is pointing out comma places. That's not even in the galaxy of what actually gets you accepted. It's just like something that could get you. If you have really careless essays, obviously that would get you rejected. But again, with all the tools out there, it's just something that's overemphasized. Okay, next overrated aspect. We have a few more. Continuity of sports or activities that aren't relevant to the student's resume. So this is something, again, that's been surprising to me over time because I've just never thought about it a ton, but like students think about it or they've asked this question a lot is, hey, starting the process in 10th grade or 11th grade or, whatever it is, maybe a little bit more down the line. It's not early in high school, but I've played this sports in high school. I did freshman soccer and then JV soccer, 9th and 10th grade. Now I'm in 11th grade. Is it going to look bad to a college if I drop the sports, right? Does it look like I guess what they're thinking is like, it's going to look like they're like a quitter, or they're thinking about just like the continuity part of the resume. And I've never really even thought about this at all because it's just like one of those things where it's just like, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference, right? If this is irrelevant to your hook and your narrative, there's no admissions officer who's going to be like, oh my God, Bob dropped soccer and didn't do varsity soccer and do all 4 years of soccer. Like, who cares? They're not coming to the school to play soccer. So a lot of students have asked this question, or parents have asked this question in the context of sports, particularly. It's actually really funny. How successful some of our applicants have been who've dropped a sport. And it was just like a very conscious decision to drop it. But it's just, it's like they understood it was a big opportunity cost and they just spend their time in a more efficient and wise and relevant way. But we had a girl a few years ago who, admissions officer at Stanford wrote back and said that she had the best application at Stanford several years ago and wrote to her, not to us, obviously. And she dropped like, I don't know what she was playing, like field hockey and lacrosse. And I think she dropped both of them, like had done them for a couple of years and then, just dropped them basically like cold turkey. It's just like, it just goes to show you like, it doesn't matter. It's not relevant to what the student is doing or what she is positioning for. She's coming to the college to be a student. She's not coming to play field hockey or lacrosse. And she was terrible at them, like literally terrible. Like it was literally a joke how bad she was at them. So Yes, that does not matter. And then there are other activities as well. Sport just happens to be one of the big ones that a lot of people ask about, if that's gonna cause any issue for college admissions. But there are other activities as well, like I was maybe on the newspaper, or I think people just have this fear of dropping something. And what I've also seen over time is a lot of people, and we've seen in our program, I think there's this fear of getting rid of stuff or starting to subtract stuff before you have stuff coming in, right? And, it's just like a fear again that it's just like, I guess, sort of trying to see it through a student or a parent's eyes. The reason why we just tend not to be worried about it is because, like, we've just done the process a million times, and so we know the additions are coming. We know that stuff is coming. It might not always come immediately, and there might be some patience and some grit in getting those opportunities, but it's like we know they're coming eventually, right? And so we're a little bit less hesitant to start subtracting things and freeing up time versus somebody else who's never been through the process. They have no experience, so you have no confidence, right? Because confidence is just basically, it just means like you have evidence from the past. Like that's all confidence means, right? It's like if you're a student listening right now and you're like, I'm not confident, it's like because you have no evidence. So go start doing something, get better at it, start accumulating evidence, and then that turns into confidence. If you're not confident, you don't have evidence. That's your fundamental problem. And it's like the only way that you get evidence is by starting when you're not confident, then doing it, then getting better, start when you suck, then you get good. Oh wow, now you're confident, right? Um, so we're confident because like we have the evidence. We've done it in the past. So it's like we know there are things coming in that will fill those voids, but we need to start taking some things out because there's a lot of nonsense in most of kids' resumes, right? And a lot of it is addition by subtraction because they have a bunch of junk in their resume and in their schedule and their time allocation, right? When you actually look at their calendar, a whole bunch of junk that's not leading them on the trajectory to get the outcome that they want. This is true of ton of students, right? Even students who do have good stuff in their resume, they still have a bunch of junk in their resume as well. For students who have, another activity that's not a sports, that is not the most conducive commitment, it's not going to be relevant to their admissions hook. So they're the student who's positioning for something in the field of anthropology, for example, and there's some totally irrelevant activity, the newspaper, they're not gonna be writing columns for anthropology, though they certainly could, right? You can certainly make that activity relevant, and so there are ways of preserving existing activities if there's a high enough upside, and that's sort of a careful audit and analysis that, we would do when we start the process, is to see, is there anything, this might not on its surface be relevant at this point in time because you haven't made it relevant, right? But once you've identified your hook and we know what the overall strategic architecture is, we can now start injecting it into activities that maybe aren't on their surface relevant, but we can make them relevant by coming up with some, columns or articles about, anthropology and then turning this into a higher value extracurricular potentially for the student, right? So you can potentially preserve certain activities. That's sort of a careful risk reward, sort of time allocation analysis. But for activities that just are not going to be relevant to the admissions hook, the through line, the narrative, of course, you can do whatever you want. Again, you can keep your track, you can keep your, whatever it is that you want to do. But if you're trying to do this optimally, it's totally fine to shave commitments that aren't going to be relevant to that hook. And you don't have to. The resume, as I often say, it's not a non-fungible part of the process like the transcript is. The transcript is your final grades, you can't change them. The resume, you get to choose what you put in the activities list, right? For the common application or the activities and awards in the UC application. Like you get to pick how you present your resume, and so it's highly fungible. So if partook of some activity, whether it's a sport or it's a non-athletic activity, and they just ended up going by the wayside, you don't even have to put it in your application in the first place. You wouldn't even have to show an admissions officer that you even partook of that activity and then stop doing it. Because if it was a low value activity, you did something for ninth and 10th grade because you were just sort of signing up. You were a serial club joiner and you were just signing up and you playing 3 sports and you sort of didn't know any better, but now you're in 10th grade and now you're very serious and you've been listening to the podcast and now like it's you got to be focused on your hook and you have high goals for yourself and you need to be very specific with your time allocation, right? Courses are going to start getting harder than they were in ninth grade. 11th grade courses much more difficult than ninth grade courses. Kind of SAT and ACT prep. Like now you get all these merging streams of the process, right? And so now you have to be much more laser focused in terms of your time allocation. You're getting a lot closer and you don't have as much time left to build your candidacy. So now you're making those decisions, and then you just sort of, we just sort of left something and let it die. If that was from ninth and 10th grade, you don't even have to put it in your application in the first place. So it's not even that they're even going to see it. And particularly, as I mentioned with sports, because they're just so low value for any students who aren't planning on being recruited athletes, it's just something that it might altogether just be left out of your activities list. And so it just doesn't even matter. But even if you did put it in and you sort of showed that you didn't do something for, it's not the end of the world. If it's something that where it would be an issue is if it's relevant to your hook, you're selling them on this passion, and there's no natural end to that thing, that might not look the best, right? So it's like if you, again, I'll just keep using the same hook analogy for this episode, but again, if you were positioning for anthropology and you started the anthropology club in ninth grade and then you did it through ninth and 10th grade, and then you stopped. I don't that's really weird. That's like really odd. That would be a red flag to an admissions officer unless there was like some reason for that. Like there was some extenuating circumstance. That would be very odd. But for a lot of these lower value relevant things, sports, some random club, that you're not going to repurpose and make it relevant to your resume, maybe would be promising you could turn into something promising, even if it hasn't been so far. But if it's not that, and it's just something that's more, dead weight, it's not relevant, it's not high value, you determine that you need to sort of do the addition by subtraction here, it's really fine to stop a commitment. There's a lot of sort of unwarranted fear around that. Okay, in terms of next overrated factor, so we have three remaining. I'm giving a huge laundry list here. GPA and weighted GPA. So GPA, first of all, big pet peeve. I will, just as a matter of convenience, I will use the term GPA a lot on the podcast. I would much prefer just to use the term grades, not GPA, for a lot of reasons. One is if you talk to any admissions officer, like one of the things that they say the most is GPA just doesn't really mean anything, right? There is an unstandardized education system in the United States, right? We have 30,000 high schools, we have public schools, we have charter schools, we have magnet schools, private schools. We have all these different schools. It's a very fractured system in a lot of ways, probably compared to a lot of other countries' systems, or certainly some number of country systems, education systems throughout the world. So you have a lot of fracturing, also because you just have a lot of states in the United States, and so you have obviously different local governments and et cetera, right? It's just not possible to have, there just doesn't exist a standardized GPA system. One school has that of 4.0, one has 4.1, one has 4.2, one has 4.3, 4.4, 4.6, 5.0, 6.0 out of 10, one has as an A, B, C, D system, one has out of 100, one has weighting, one has no weighting. Some schools don't even give any grades. They give out emojis nowadays. Like it's just a mess. There are a couple of states, I believe, in the United States that have standardized GPAs throughout a couple of states in the South. But generally speaking, it's non-standardized. So it's just to take a student's GPA wholesale and just use it in the admissions process just makes no sense because you're comparing apples to oranges for students across different high schools. And then some schools don't even calculate a GPA at all, right? So they might have grades, but they don't calculate a GPA. Again, there's just a million different systems, right? So that's one really big problem. Another problem is a GPA. I discussed this a lot in the how to actually interpret acceptance data episode that I mentioned earlier in this episode. But GPA is an average. The problem with an average, so average is referred to as a measure of central thrust. You have modes, you have medians, you have averages. People know this from basic statistics, but it's just an average. The problem with an average is it's susceptible to outliers, and it doesn't show you the spread of the data per se, right? So you don't know if you're looking at a GPA and it's a 3.5, it could be that the student has 50% 4.0s and they have 50% 3.0s. you would measure that by standard deviation, right? So a lot of times in statistics or when doing studies, you'll report an average and then you report a standard deviation because the standard deviation shows you the spread, sort of the variance in the data, what sort of the distance is from the average. But you just can't see things like spread from just an average. You have to look at the transcript to really see what the actual breakdown is of the grades, right? And so you can see things like progressions. I think this is so vastly overrated. I think there's a whole bunch of people who are hoping that I tell them that because they had B's in ninth grade that, they can have A's through the rest of high school and it won't matter for selective colleges, highly selective colleges. And that's just unfortunately not true. It's not that colleges won't see that trend. It's not that they don't look at that trend overall, but it's just, again, you're competing with students who were straight A's from the get-go and they hit the ground running when they were in ninth grade, right? So try not to make that mistake. A lot of people hope springs eternal and they don't want to hear that message, but you need to hit the ground running when you're in high school. And it just, again, it's a competition. It's law of large numbers. There's somebody else who didn't have that problem and they hit the ground running and they had straight A's in ninth grade. So that said, of course, you can't see trajectory from a GPA. You can only see that by looking at the transcript. Of course, if there was some crazy situation or anomaly or the student had some big diagnosis, which like gets really into like a whole bunch of other complex factors, you wouldn't be able to tell that from a GPA. You'd only tell that from a transcript, right? So grades is the much better term that I like to use because it's really what actually maps onto the way that admissions officers review the application, right? They're not going to swallow the student's high school, their cumulative GPA wholesale. They're going to look at the grades. And having an A GPA or having an A average is a lot different from having straight A's, right? And so when we're talking about these top and highly selective colleges, when I look at a student's transcript, or we in our program look at a student's transcript, they could say like, my GPA is this, or like, we like never really even look at it. It's just like, look at the grades. The first thing I'm usually look at is like, literally the first thing that I look at when looking at a transcript is, are there any B's on this transcript? That's the very first thing that I look at for a transcript. It's just like, are there any B's? Right? So, and a lot of admissions officers can be very similar, right? It's like, yeah, they're gonna say that they're like rooting for you and giving you the benefit of the doubt. Honestly, when you have so many applications, like you're looking for reasons to just like get this out of the applicant pile. It's just like, give me a fast reason why I could eliminate this application. Like when you're hit with just a pile of applications and pages upon pages, this notion that they're looking for reasons to give you the benefit of the doubt when you have B's and there's straight A's in the file right below yours, and then 10 other ones after that, and then 100 after that with straight A is insane. That they're trying to give you, they're trying to get through all the applications. That's what they're trying to do, and they're not trying to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're trying to pick the best applicants. Hate to break it to you. GPA averages, their problems with averages, doesn't show you the actual breakdown, doesn't show you the distribution, doesn't show you any progressions over time. It doesn't show you what classes the student took per se, like if they're positioning for this area. I don't know what their exact grades were. If they're on a 100-point scale and they have 98s, then like, but they have some 92s, or the 92s in the classes that are relevant to their admissions hook, because that wouldn't be as ideal. You'd want the 98s now you would prefer to have all 98s, obviously, in an ideal world. But if there were some variance or discrepancy between the 98s and the 92s, I think it's pretty commonsensical that you would want the 98s to be in the fields or the subjects that are more related to your positioning, and you'd want the 92s to be in the fields that are not as close to your positioning, right? And if you're a senior, a rising senior, or parent of a rising senior applying right now, this is what I'm talking about when I say pick your narrative or your hook based on the evidence. So it's like if you have a bunch of lower grades, probably don't put the spotlight on the lower grades. If you have a bit of a lower verbal test, it's like you have a little bit lower math or science test score, right? Now it can't be too low, right? So like, again, we're talking about top colleges here, right? So we're talking very high scores overall. But it's, if you have a 34 ACT or 33 ACT, you have a little bit of an outlier in terms of one of the section scores, you're obviously going to want to put more emphasis on the stronger scores in terms of your admissions hook, right? Now, everything doesn't always line up perfectly across the application where you can get all your best test scores, your test sections, and your subjects and your course rigor and your resume to all align. There will be a little bit of a give and take there, but you want to do your best job that you possibly can to get your hook to align with your strengths and not with your weaknesses, right? So, but you wouldn't know that from, again, a GPA. So GPA is very problematic, and this is a highly overrated part of the admissions process. People mentioning their GPA, just it's like eh, it's almost meaningless. Well, again, when a student says GPA, it's just like go straight to the transcript, look at the specific courses, look at the specific grades. It's just like, I don't care what your GPA is. And again, it's just like every single high school. It's like there's a million different high schools. So you're like, I have a 4.2. It's like unweighted, weighted. How do they weight it? The school weights it this way. They weight it that way. It's just a fairly useless metric. So highly overrated. Adjacent to that is weighting. A lot of students are very concerned about weighting. Does some other students' GPA look like it's more weighted compared to mine at a different high school? Yeah, etc. We think about these as two entirely different constructs, right? So you have your grades and then you have your course rigor, right? So the best way to frame this wouldn't be GPA or weighted GPA or thinking about your weighting. It would be, here are all of my raw grades, no weighting, totally unweighted, and then here's my course rigor, right? Two separate constructs, right? Because that's how admissions officers will view, they view them as two separate constructs. And in terms of your course rigor, right, it's like that might be, might be whatever that metric is, right? It might be 8 APs, it might be, and you can obviously do honors and etc. And for a lot of the most, there might be somebody who's honors, like, with the APs, and this is a very, obviously a very nuanced topic, right? But for students who are targeting the top 20 schools in the United States, right? Bare minimum is pretty much 8 APs or 8 college courses or whatever it is, advanced topics, whatever your school has, because they don't have an AP curriculum, because the history and English teachers complained about it or whatever. But generally, 8 is going to be like bare minimum for highly selective colleges. Vast majority of students should be much more towards the middle of the range, ideally, and then 15 plus is probably going to be, like quite obviously quite good. Obviously, there's variations in terms of what's afforded at each high school. I've talked about this in past episodes. Students can take external college courses. You can still overcome the limitations of your high school course rigor. That's just sort of a broad range, right? But that's sort of what we consider course rigor. It's like, I took 10 APs, I took 12 APs. And you consider honors. It just gets really messy with all the different course designations, different tiers. A lot of times the honors end up leading toward the APs anyway, or, whatever the college course is. So it's sort of a bit of a, sort of subsumes it in some way. You have your course rigor, and then you have your grades, unweighted, right? That's really the best way of looking at it, and that's the way that we look at it. When students start thinking about like weighting, it's just like you start merging concepts and it starts getting messy because what's the weight that's applied at the high school? It's different from a different high school. It's different from the other 30,000 high schools, for students across the country. It's just like, it's just a bunch of messiness and annoyance for no reason. So, just don't, this is highly overrated. This both GPA and notion of a weighted GPA, separate these two variables out and say, these are my raw unweighted grades, and this is my course rigor. And they're two separate dissociated constructs is how you should look at it. And if you want to be competitive for top and highly selective schools, you should be basically a straight A student, unweighted, right? And you should take very high course rigor. That's what it takes for those colleges, right? So students who think like, oh, my GPA is weighted, or it's like there's sort of this notion that, the high school's giving you all this extra credit because like you take these APs, but when you're applying to these highly selective colleges, this is just table stakes. This is what you're expected to do because you're applying to one of the top colleges, right? So it's just like, of course, they're expecting you to take really rigorous courses. There's no bonus points for that, right? It's like, okay, you take 8 APs, like that's barely viable, right, for selective colleges. So like you're on the very low end of the margins there. It's not like, but then your high school might be like, oh, we give you all this extra weighting for 8 APs, and like you're like, well, I'm like really special. It's like, no, like this is barely what's tolerable or acceptable for most of the top colleges. I would view them as two totally separate constructs. And then related to that, the only exception would be if your school ranks. So if your school ranks and they include the weighted GPA, or if your school gives out things like valedictorian or salutatorian and they do it, and I only know of one high school that does this, and they have multiple valedictorians, and the valedictorian just is basically a student has all 4.0s throughout high school. I don't know of any other schools that either have multiple valedictorians or even that put the valedictorian, that announcement, sort of those usual like end of senior year recognitions that put them before the application process, though it's actually like it's really good that the school does it. It's very, strategic because by June or May of senior year, it's like the college doesn't, unless your school ranks, it's just like you can't put that in your college application at that point in time. It's actually pretty good that that this high school does that. But I'm not aware of any other high schools. I'm sure there's 30,000 high schools in the United States. There may be some other high school that does announce, certain recognitions before students apply to college, but it's usually later in the senior year. So that usually wouldn't come into play. But if a student's class ranking were used to determine valedictorian or salutatorian, and that happened to be before the application process, and it could be an award that goes into the student's, application, and they used weighted GPA to determine that along the way, well, then, yes, then obviously that could have, some implications potentially because there's some local high school level, weighting that goes into a local level sort of award or distinction. Class rank does matter in terms of college admissions. If your school does rank, that does matter, and it does provide a lot of perspective. So if you think you're amazing in straight A's and you take really hard classes, but you're like number 63 in your class, that provides a lot of perspective. And a lot of people would be shocked, especially for the schools that don't rank, if they saw the distributions of the GPAs, that they're just not actually as high as they think that they would be because they're just looking at a very local perspective, right? And just not understanding there's just a ton of other kids who have all the same grades or better than they do and take hard courses. So, but if your school does use class rank, then that is a factor that would go into the evaluation of your file. And then vicariously, through that by proxy, the weighted GPA could matter because class rank exists at a local level, but it is being used for college admissions. And then also the weighted GPA exists at a local level and it's being used to compute the class ranks. So none of the weighted GPA matters per se. It's that it only matters by virtue or by way of the class rank. Okay, two more overrated factors, relationships with or contacting admissions officers. So I've mentioned several past episodes in this episode that are sort of good reference episodes if you guys want a fuller, longer exposition of a certain topic, again, particularly for people who have maybe started tuning into the podcast a little bit more recently. So I did an episode called Should You Contact Admissions Officers? And a lot of that episode was about just the demonstrated interest in general, right? The different forms of demonstrated interest. I broke it down into strong versus weak forms of demonstrated interest. It can be different problems with the notion of demonstrated interest, where it's really useful, where it's less useful, what are higher leverage ways of demonstrated interest, what are lower leverage ways of demonstrated interest. I did, toward the back end of that episode, go through past students who got into a top Ivy a few years ago from our program, and I went through like a template email that she had sent to the admissions officer after they came through her high school for a high school information session. So that is in that episode. I'll sort of recap a little bit here, but it's just sort of this bit of a notion among particularly parents as they get closer to, when particularly this starts arising in usually over the summer into the fall going into senior year where, they sort of hear from another mom at the yoga studio or some neighbor that, oh, Johnny, next door, or Bobby from the country club is, they're reaching out to admissions officers and making contacts, right? And they're making relationships. It's just a bunch of nonsense. Bunch of nonsense. And it's a bunch of the same, a lot of this like status signaling, just, it's like people thinking they're special. They're not special at all. It's like you have no relationship with this admissions officer. They don't care. Like, I hate to break it to you, but it's just like, it's their job. Like, they have template emails, they write back. It's just like, you're not becoming a pen pal with admissions officer at Penn. Like, it's just like, come on, right? So this notion that you need to like send them, emails. I talk in that episode about what the appropriate vehicles are for communication. There should be some impetus for the communication. You should not just be reaching out of the blue. And I talk about in that episode, it's just there's a way more ways that this can go wrong than can go right. So there's way more risk to talking to admissions officers than there is upside in talking to admissions officers. You really just want to tread with caution. But I talk about how like there should be some impetus, right? It's like if you met an admissions officer on a school visit or they came to your high school, there should be some reason. It shouldn't just be like, oh, I have some random question, because again, it's baseline versus plot line, right? It's just like baseline, you're like, oh, I'm checking a box, like I sent them an email, etc. Right? But the plot line is always, why are they sending an email? They're trying to be manipulative. They're trying to get me to like them, or it's just like, and it just always gets weird when kids reach out. Or just like it's not easy. Like those sort of optics to sort of balance there of not coming across manipulative or, it's just like it's very hard to balance. And so you should really only do it when you have a context where you can reference something specific because they gave a presentation. I really like this and it's related to my interest in this. It's like there should be some impetus and some specific contextual calibration, and it should be sparse. It should be like a one shot, usually, just like, and it should be particularly ideally close to when you're applying, right? Because there's at least a chance they remember your email and they remember you from the info session. It's like they're not going to remember you because you're like a school visit in like ninth grade or 10th grade. They shouldn't even be doing anyway. They're not going to remember that down the line in the application. So just usually you want to be proximate. You want there to be some impetus, some contextual, specificity there. But a lot of people, I've just heard this. It's sort of one of the things out of the many things that there are to worry about in this process. This is one of the things that a lot of people, as they get closer to senior year, they hear that, like, again, some friend, some neighbor, it's just like, and the person just doesn't, like, most of you have no idea what they're talking about. And like people listen to them and they're like, my neighbor said this. It's like, my friend said this. It's like, I have no idea what they're talking about whatsoever. It's like, I don't know why you're listening to them. So if you hear somebody and they're like, oh, or, Johnny is setting up like a really good relationship with the admissions officer, it's just like, it's nonsense. I wouldn't worry about it at all. And if you want a fuller exposition on this topic, go back and listen to that episode, Should You Contact Admissions Officers? Okay. Last item that we have here on this long list of overrated aspects of college admissions. So this one also, like the comment app, might come as a little bit of a surprise. I'm going to say the application process. So, how could it be that the application process is one of the most overrated aspects of college admissions? Okay, so let me explain. So there are two different parts of the overall admissions process, right? What we refer to a lot of times is the story building phase, and then there's the storytelling phase, right? Or you could refer it as the candidacy building and then the candidacy selling. There's the pre-application process, then there's the application process. I think everybody this is fairly intuitive, right? It's you build your candidacy over several years, right? You're building your grades, your course rigor, your test scores, your resume, which takes the longest to build. You're building that over multiple years, right? And you then, once you get to the application process, you're packaging all of that for the colleges, right? You're sort of putting it in the final form, right? And there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the way, and I don't think that enough people really take advantage of this flexibility, but there's a lot of flexibility into how you spin that data and that narrative, right? You need to audit your strengths, if there's any discrepancy in terms of grades, discrepancy in terms of subjects on the SAT or like, you always want to put maximal spotlight on your strengths. If your resume is mostly speaks to a specific label or subject, like you would want to ideally, again, if you're trying to get to the best college and do it most strategically, then you would want to make that your narrative for college admissions and put those majors and spin that narrative because that's what you have evidence for in your resume and you're applying to college. You can't change it at this point in time. Now, if you're the person who's like, I have to do business and I want to do business and applying to colleges that have, a direct admit business program and I won't do anything except for business and like, I don't care that I built a resume that doesn't have anything to do with business and like, that's not my fault. Like I didn't know about any of this stuff, and you're stupid and this process is stupid and like this notion of a hook is stupid and like why can't you just study business when like you didn't do anything in business? So if you're that person and like you just want to like apply for business or computer science, even though like you're not a impressive or competitive computer science applicant and like, I don't know, may not get into like a whole bunch of colleges that you want, it's like whatever, you do whatever you want. Right. So like if you just have some very specific program or path and you're just very rigid on that and you don't want to sort of audit your strengths and like you can definitely do that. You just have to understand, again, this is informed consent. You probably won't get into as competitive of schools, and that is a liability because you're proclaiming something or selling them on a narrative that you don't have very strong support for, right? And my much bigger issue with that is you need to ask yourself, if you didn't do anything in business for all of this time, like, how the heck do you know that you're so passionate about business? Like, if you just don't have a very compelling business resume or like You're just not like the kid who was hustling and they were doing business and they were watching business YouTube videos and taking business like they were actually, I don't know, this is crazy, actually substantiating their interest in business. If you weren't that, or you have a kid and they weren't like that, like I think you kind of have to ask yourself a question of how interested you actually are in business or whatever. Insert X particularly popular nice sounding career path you want to insert here, right? Like I think you need to actually look at the evidence, right? Because a lot of times the evidence is there for a reason, right? It's like you have a whole bunch of free time, like probably look at how you spend it and probably audit how you spend your free time and what you're actually good at versus just again falling to all these default biases. Or this sounds good. This sounds like a career that, I want to tell people about because like it sounds good. That aside, the application process in that candidacy selling mode, you're taking in your packaging. You have a lot of flexibility and you could spin it however you want. However, there's still a lot of problems at that point if you did not partake of the correct actions earlier in the process. So if you're late to the game in terms of resume building, there's only so much you can do, and there's a cap on your candidacy, and there are a lot of colleges that will have been removed from the table. There are students who have early grades issues, as I've talked a lot about in this podcast. There's nothing I can do. There's to some extent nothing you can do except to try to make your candidacy as the best that you possibly can from this point going forward. But if you had lower grades earlier in high school, again, should understand their students and they didn't have those issues and they're in the applicant pool and you're competing against them. It's just a tough sell. It's just a tough sell to an admissions officer when they have tons of those kids who had none of those grades issues, right? So it's just like there's just too many students who have straight A's. There are all of these different mistakes or suboptimal decisions, or you started too late, or you didn't know about this hook thing, and you only started building your hook or your resume halfway through 11th grade. But then there's just going to be a cap, right? There's going to be a cap on your ceiling and your candidacy in terms of what's viable for you because the students, particularly for the most competitive schools, they're going to be building their resume over multiple years. Even I was just talking, on the phone, it's just like, have a student who's in the same grade, ninth grade going to 10th grade, but then you have a student who started with this year earlier in the year, started a year ahead. And it's just like, you can look at what sort of like the resumes look like, and one is just much further ahead because they had an extra year of they solidified their hook, right? Like extremely early. And like they've just been compounding progress for an extra year. And it's not like linear. It's like there's a lot of exponential effect here or compounding. You do earlier actions and they start snowballing and snowballing into much bigger, higher value opportunities. And also when you're reaching out to people to get opportunities or to get an internship or to apply for a program or to get a research position or whatever it is, you have to have done earlier things to have a more impressive resume, right? We have kids who send resumes to college professors and they're like, oh my God, I look at your resume. It's like, I feel like I haven't even accomplished anything in life. And this person's like a professor at like Cornell, right? We've had professors send emails like that to our kids. In order to get higher value opportunities over time, you have to have built a resume and partaken in the actions earlier on because it's cumulative, right? It's like I often use the investing analogy, right? It's like you have to have to get all of the value and the compounding interest over time. It's like you had to been putting in the small investments over a long period of time that start to really compound and then snowball. I think it was Einstein said that compounding interest is, compounding is the most powerful force in the world. This is compounding progress. So having that early start, like it just generates, and particularly for kids, I think it's just like you do all the small actions but you do them every single week, week in, week out, week in, week out. 5 items, 6 items, 7 items in this due, checked off, checked off, checked off. And it's like, it's just then you look up one day, just telling the story, right? And it's just like you're suffering from imposter syndrome, like a ninth grader. It's like I'm 13. Like, what on earth does this person, why would they even work with me? They're like, I'm a nobody. But they keep doing, yeah, just sending the emails, just doing the actions, writing the short stories, just whatever it is, you just do it because you're like, I'm not confident. It's just like you don't have evidence. You don't have evidence. right? So you wouldn't be, why would you be confident? But the only way to be confident is you got to build evidence. The only way to build evidence, you got to start when you're not confident, right? So it's just like, you got to still do it. You still got to put in the inputs. It doesn't matter whether you think you belong, you don't belong, whether mom thinks this is stupid, whether your dad thinks that you're too young. It's like, it doesn't matter. Their opinions don't matter. Your opinion doesn't even matter, right? It's just like, you're like, I don't deserve this. I don't, it's like, why would they? It doesn't matter. The only thing that we know, the only thing that's inevitable is that you gotta do the things, you gotta put in the actions if you want to see any results or any outcomes. You gotta start somewhere, right? So you can't stay in your head. And so, I have a ninth grade girl, and she's like, what do these people, why would they respond to me? Why would they want to work with me? And then it's just like, you just do it, then you get something. It's like, before you know it, in some cases, it's like, you look up end of ninth grade and you're like, my God, like, I'm working with this person who's a leader in their field. I'm working with this person, right? It's just like, and you couldn't even imagine it. Some cases it might be, 2 or 3, like, look up and there's something massive. It does take that compounding progress. And I think that a lot of students are done, I think, a significant disservice by high school, because the reward mechanisms, although they are good and they are useful, because you get a lot of immediate feedback, right? In high school, it's just, you study for a test, you do well or you don't do well, right? It's just like a very fast turnaround to punishment and reward. Everything's metrics. It's like you get report cards, parents, pat you on the back, whatever. To me, it's a video game. And video games are extremely powerful and extremely effective for a reason, extremely addictive, right? It's like, you beat this boss, you take this test, you then level up to here, now you're on level 2, now you're in this grade, now you're in this next part of the subject. It's like you're constantly getting immediate reward and punishment mechanisms. My problem with that, even though it's a very good structure and a very good system in a lot of ways, because again, you get fast feedback, it doesn't track to a lot of real world, a lot of how life actually works. A lot of times, and this is true of the resume building, which is why I think resume actually tracks, and a lot of the outside the classroom tracks to real life a lot better than inside the classroom does, is in a lot of life, like, you're doing something and you don't know if it's going to work out, right? Like, you're dealing with much higher decision making under uncertainty in real life, right? It's like, it's not like you have some like big problem and somebody's like, hey, is it like A or B? Is this true or false? It's just like, that's not how reality usually works, right? So you have to partake in all these actions. And this is why I say, like, when you're taking something out of your resume, it's like the kid's like, oh, I don't know if I want to remove this because, like, I don't know if I'm gonna get something better. But it's like, we've been through this process. We're like, just get rid of it. We need to make space because, like, we know this thing will come through if we send enough emails, if we just like do all of the day in, day out actions, like, we know this will come through, but you're really worried because you're very averse to the uncertainty. A lot of people are very averse to risk and the uncertainty. And a lot of this process is decision making under uncertainty. And you're like, I don't know if this is gonna, like, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna like, I don't know if any of this is gonna work, but you have to keep putting in the inputs. But you also need all of the compounding progress from those inputs over time. And then you'd be surprised, you'd be shocked at what happens. And then somebody said it's like, you're like 20 years to become an overnight success, right? Even though this podcast, and I think increasingly, a lot of people have become aware of the importance of the earlier parts of the process and starting the process a lot earlier, not just when you're all the way at the back end of the process and applying to college, when you have this immediate pain point. And now you have to hear that these colleges are out of the running. You didn't build your resume, you don't have an effective hook. Now you're building activities very late. And if they're built too late, they look disingenuous because they're too close to the application cycle. You're just like, they're not going to be as impressive or high value because they're, again, it's just like admissions officers can see what you're potentially doing. It's just like versus the kid who started in ninth grade or eighth grade or seventh grade, then 10th grade on the later end, ideally the later end. I think that a lot of people are still very application process focused. They're very much in like this quote unquote matching, which I just hate this term. There's this notion I talked to a student like a month and a half ago, right? And I said, like, what stood out about our advising is like, your parents have spoken to like 18 different advisors or whatever, right? It's like, what stood out about our advising program? Right. And I would like, I was hoping they were going to say like, Sam, you're so articulate and handsome and charming, with all these rants and tangents you go on forever on this podcast. I just couldn't resist. But she just said something like, you're like the only program that starts working with kids like earlier on. and that actually like is fundamentally like trying to change their candidacy. Everybody else, all the other advisors, the school counselor, all these private advisors you go to, they're all like, yeah, like, go launch nonprofit. And like, we'll see you in 6 months, right? And like, then we'll like see how it all comes together for the applications, right? It's like that drives me insane, right? Like this notion that there's a million things you can be doing and you're in ninth grade or eighth grade or whatever it is, and you are just going to live with whatever your candidacy ends up being and just leaving it to chance. Like you're just a feather in the wind. And like, we hope that you blow, right next to a pot of gold, but you might, blow right next to, some dog doo doo. And like, we're just going to leave it to, like, that is such a low agency framework. And I'm so big on just high agency, controlling your fate as much as you possibly can, your future. You can create value. You can do it from anywhere. You don't need to be in this stupid in-person summer program. It's just a very low agency view of the process. And even this term that I've heard from some person I once read was like bashing me in some, forum or whatever. And they're like, is like, he's everything that's wrong with the college matching process. And it's like, I hate that term matching process because the matching process sort of, if this is just a matching, it just like kind of assumes that you kind of are what you are. It's like you can't change it. I just like I hate that. Like I reject that notion. I just reject that notion as a life philosophy, or you just are what you are and you can't change it and you can't make it better. I just think it's a terrible mindset for kids to have. I don't like this notion. She was just saying it's just like everybody's like, you just sort of be what you are, and then like we'll tell you what it equals in the end, right? It's just like we'll tell you if you're competitive for these schools. It's like, well, I still have a lot of time. Like, I could still make my candidacy way better. And they're like, yeah, like, we don't really do that. Right. It's like, or maybe they'll do like once every 6 month check ins, or like once every 3 months, or give you some like very high level guidance or whatever. Like, that is like 99% of most advising. Even the best high schools in the country, I've never heard of any high school for all of this nonsense about how high touch all these private counseling and Exeter, and there's all this ridiculous nonsense about parents want the head of whoever it is of counseling at Exeter, who's like basically a social justice warrior masquerading as an admission strategist. Like it's just like there's no high school in the United States I'd ever seen, no matter how high touch, or how good the high school is, that is ever working with a ninth grader or 10th grader to fundamentally change their candidacy. Never seen a single one ever. Right. And so, you can accept this notion of, it's application and it's application process and it's late junior year and it's halfway through junior year and it's the summer and like I'll just sort of see what it adds up to and sort of, cash in for my prizes then. But like you might realize like you're like 100 tickets short, $100 short for like going to Penn, like it's just like you didn't build the candidacy that you needed to. I still think as much as we've tried to sort of, and on this podcast, sort of shift the frame towards this does like you need to be thinking about these and tackling this much earlier on, or you are taking colleges off the table. And one of the problems is that people don't know colleges are being removed from their list because nobody's showing them, but they literally are in real time. They're being removed like it's gone. The college is gone, and you're only in 10th grade, and it's already gone, right? Because you made some mistake, you didn't start early, and like it's just, and that's what it's actually like. The problem is, it's not like school, and you have no report cards. Like there's no. We always joke all the time. It's not like the admissions officer is like sending you a report card where they're like, "Hey, like you're not on track, or you're on track," and they don't even know because they haven't even seen all the applicants. Like, they don't even know who's gonna apply, and it's a relative competition that rewards the people who do the most, right? So it's like whoever does the most wins. It doesn't matter, what you think of that. It's just like they take the best. There's a certain cutoff, there's a certain number of spots, and it's like, that's what we take, basically. So, I still think that this is very late stage focus towards the application process. That paradigm still hasn't like in the grand scheme, there's like barely been a dent that's been made in it. So a lot of people just focusing much more towards the back end and the sort of storytelling versus the full story building phase. And the problem with that is just like, again, there's just options that are removed. There's just things that you can't do. You can do a lot. And certainly if you're in that position and you're starting late, or you're like, I didn't know this podcast or any of this stuff was even a thing. Like, you know, you're still like, there's still tons and tons of people who are still highly uninformed about this process. And you're even fortunate to be well ahead of still the majority of people. But you still try to do the best that you possibly can. And there's still a lot that you can do. There's still a lot of flexible strategic positioning and how to sell your narrative and how to think creatively. And I've gone through this on multiple episodes on the podcast. There's still a ton that you can do. And I don't think you shouldn't despair. If you are in that position, you can only do the best that you can, right? Just not optimal to be thinking about, the past, or I could have, it's like, you can't change it. So it doesn't matter. Should do the best you can going forward. But I think if you are in younger grades, you're younger in the process, like, you do have to understand that you make those decisions and the consequences are very far down the line, which I think is one of the most insidious parts of this process. And it's one of the most insidious parts of life, I think, to be honest, is that a lot of the consequences to your decisions are very far downstream. And it's just like, if somebody had just sort of said to you, it's like, you didn't study for the test and now you get slapped with like a bad grade. It's like, you would immediately know, but a lot of people don't, because there's no fast feedback loop. This is a very deferred process in terms of the feedback that you get. So I would just encourage people, do not put overemphasis on the application process. This notion of like, you're just matching, you just sort of like are what you are, and you'll just be, I mean, you can take that low agency view if you want. I just don't agree with it. As I said, as either an admissions philosophy or as a life philosophy, I just reject it wholeheartedly. I think you try to do the most that you possibly can in life and in this process to give yourself the best chance that you can, if you really want it. Again, it's big asterisks. It's like, if you really want it. If you're a parent, you can't force it on a kid to want it if they don't really want it to that level. There's nothing you can do. We all have our subjective preferences, and some people just want certain things more. We can only pick a few things that we want to sacrifice a lot for. For those people who do really want it, just being extremely proactive and not thinking just towards the very late stages and back into this process, because by that point, a lot of your late stage actions just won't matter, or there'll just be a ceiling. It's just like, as I've said, it's like, if you made early mistakes or there's early opportunity costs, you could be writing essays, but like, you're not getting to that college anyway. It just doesn't matter. If you have certain low grades, it's not that you still shouldn't do your best, but unfortunately it does set a cap on your overall candidacy and your odds. So I would strongly encourage people to be thinking, this is just a sort of an infinite game, and something that you're always thinking about trying to make the right decisions, starting early. And one of the biggest things that you can benefit from is all of the compounding effect of putting in the right actions and the right inputs over a long stretch of time, just like in investing, except this is an investment in yourself and your education and your future. I think that that's still quite underrated, the earlier parts of this candidacy building process versus just the late stage application process. And it's still mostly non-existent at basically every single high school in terms of the way that they counsel students, even the best and the most private across the United States. And it's still very non-existent in the vast majority of private counselors as well. This notion on much earlier, highly involved type of process. So that's it. I'm going to leave off there this episode. A lot to digest, a lot that is overrated about the process. Hopefully this was helpful to everybody. We'll talk to you in the next episode. Bye-bye.